Architectures of spiritual consciousness, the transgressive-transformative mode, the central intuition. Not everything that arises within us deserves obedience, but neither does everything that frightens, disgusts, shames, or threatens us deserve exile. The ascetic-purificatory mode discovers one form of freedom by learning that desire is not command. An impulse may arise without requiring enactment. A pleasure may be available without becoming necessary. A craving may insist, and consciousness may discover that it can remain still. The transgressive-transformative mode begins from the other side of the same problem. It notices that consciousness can also become bound by what it cannot approach. A person may be governed not only by what they compulsively seek, but by what they must compulsively avoid. Not only by desire, but by disgust. Not only by attachment, but by recoil. Not only by appetite, but by the places where consciousness says, "This must not come near me." What cannot be refused can rule us from the side of craving. What cannot be approached can rule us from the side of contraction. The two forms of bondage often resemble opposites. Psychologically, however, both give the object disproportionate power. Someone who cannot stop pursuing sexual experience is clearly governed by sexuality, but someone whose spiritual identity depends upon sexuality remaining permanently outside the sacred may also remain organized around it. Someone obsessed with social recognition is governed by reputation, but someone who cannot endure disgrace, misunderstanding, ridicule, or loss of respectability may be governed by reputation no less deeply. Someone dependent upon intoxication has surrendered freedom to a substance. But someone whose consciousness contracts around the very idea of ritual contact with an intoxicant may reveal another kind of dependency, not upon consumption, but upon distance. The transgressive mind begins to notice this hidden sovereignty. It asks a dangerous question. What if the things consciousness excludes continue to shape it precisely through the force required to keep them excluded? This does not mean that everything prohibited is secretly desirable. It does not mean that fear is always irrational. It does not mean that disgust has no biological or ethical function. It does not mean that every boundary should be crossed. The distinctive intuition is subtler. A boundary becomes spiritually significant when the energy surrounding it exceeds its practical function. Something contracts, something recoils, something insists that contact itself would contaminate, degrade, unmake, or spiritually invalidate the person. At that point, the boundary has ceased to operate merely as discrimination. It has become a metaphysical wall, and the transgressive-transformative mode turns toward the wall. Every spiritual culture creates boundaries, sacred and profane, pure and impure, permitted and forbidden, initiated and uninitiated, monastic and worldly, male and female, edible and inedible, clean and polluted, holy and obscene. The boundaries may serve genuine purposes. They can protect health, preserve ritual coherence, stabilize communities, restrain destructive impulses, or guide a practitioner through a developmental stage. But boundaries have a peculiar psychological tendency. What begins as a useful distinction can gradually acquire the weight of reality itself. A rule concerning food becomes a statement about what kinds of substance can bear divinity. A sexual discipline becomes a metaphysical judgment about sexuality. A monastic structure becomes a division between sacred life and ordinary life. A cultural prejudice becomes cosmic purity. A temporary restraint becomes an eternal picture of liberation. The distinction hardens. Then consciousness no longer says, "This is inappropriate here." It says, "This cannot belong to the sacred." That transition is crucial. The transgressive mode does not fundamentally attack distinction. It attacks exclusion made absolute. This distinction is essential because transgressive spirituality is often misunderstood through the crude slogan that all boundaries are artificial and must therefore disappear. That is not freedom. A mature human being still distinguishes medicine from poison, consent from coercion, intimacy from violation, nourishment from harm, honesty from deception, responsibility from irresponsibility. The collapse of discrimination is not non-duality, it is confusion. The deeper problem appears when a functional distinction becomes ontological. When "I should not do this" quietly becomes "this has no place in reality," or "this person is dangerous to me" becomes "this kind of person is spiritually polluting," or "I choose not to engage in this act" becomes "iki." A person who engages in it cannot belong to the sacred. The transgressive mode finds its field precisely there. It does not necessarily abolish the boundary, it interrogates the contraction that has gathered around it. Few traditions analyze this contraction as precisely as the non-dual Shaiva Kaula traditions associated with Abhinavagupta. One of their central concerns was not simply whether an object had been classified as pure or impure, but what happened inside consciousness when that classification became a site of recoil. The term Shanka can carry the sense of doubt, hesitation, apprehension. In the Kaula context, it can become something more visceral, a contracting uncertainty before that which consciousness has learned to treat as spiritually dangerous. One does not merely think this is forbidden. The body mind shrinks. The practitioner hesitates. Something inside withdraws. The distinction becomes embodied. The excluded object acquires an almost magnetic negative charge. Related to this is the impurity of differentiation, Pedamala, not differentiation in the ordinary sense that allows us to recognize one thing as distinct from another, but the deeper contraction through which difference becomes separation inside reality itself. Here is sacredness. There is what sacredness cannot contain. Here is Bhairava. There is what must somehow remain outside Bhairava. The Kaula operation presses precisely upon that impossibility. If reality is genuinely non-dual, where exactly could the impure object stand in order to be outside it? The question is not answered merely by repeating, everything is Shiva. That can remain a doctrine perfectly compatible with visceral contraction. The question must eventually reach the place where consciousness still says, yes, everything is Shiva, but not that, and that not that becomes the altar. This is one of the deepest intuitions of the transgressive-transformative mode. The excluded object is often spiritually useful, not because it is intrinsically sacred, shocking, pleasurable, or powerful, but because it reveals the precise place where consciousness still establishes a border inside reality. The taboo is therefore not the essence of the practice, it is an instrument. The taboo is an instrument. The contraction is the target. This distinction changes everything. Liquor does not become spiritually superior to water because it is prohibited. Sex does not become more enlightened than celibacy because it is charged. A cremation ground is not metaphysically higher than a garden. Human remains are not spiritually more authentic than flowers. The spiritually relevant question is, where is the contraction? If a substance carries no significant boundary for a practitioner, using it merely because an old text considered it transgressive may accomplish little. If an act already coincides perfectly with the person's appetites, calling it sacred may merely provide theology for desire. If the practitioner is fascinated by shock itself, more shocking acts may strengthen rather than dissolve the identity built around transgression. The effective support is contingent, the contraction is primary. This is why historical forms of transgression cannot simply be copied. A taboo belongs partly to a culture. Its psychological voltage depends upon what a particular human community has invested in it. The same object may function very differently across centuries, societies, and individual nervous systems. A practice that pierced one person's world may be meaningless theater for another. The question is never merely, was the prohibition crossed? The real question is, did consciousness become less bound? The same structure appears outside explicitly tantric ritual. Consider disgust. Disgust is one of the most powerful boundary-making forces available to the human organism. It protects us. Rotting food, bodily contamination, infection, disease, recoil can preserve life. But disgust also becomes cultural. Whole categories of human beings can become contaminated by association, untouchable, degraded, polluting, not to be eaten with, not to be touched, not to be entered into relation with. At that point, the boundary is no longer simply biological. The nervous system has become the carrier of a social metaphysics. Some forms of agora confront precisely this domain. The cremation ground is not merely a dramatic spiritual stage. It gathers several of the most powerful human exclusions into one field: death, decay, bodily dissolution, fear, pollution, the destruction of social identity. To enter such a place deliberately can become a way of approaching what ordinary consciousness maintains at a distance. Yet the same principle can appear far from the cremation ground. An agori may work among people whom respectable society refuses to approach. The diseased, dying, abandoned, or physically disfigured. The operation is related. The boundary says, do not come near. Transgressive consciousness asks, what is happening in me that requires this distance to become absolute? This is where the mode touches the compassionate liberative configuration without becoming identical to it. Compassion sees suffering and says, "Your pain matters." Transgression may see the same person and ask, "Why has consciousness constructed a world in which your very presence is treated as pollution?" The mature act may therefore be something as simple as sitting beside someone from whom everyone else recoils. No skull, no ritualized sexual act, no theatrical antinomianism. The charged boundary has already been found. Fear functions similarly. Fear can be intelligent. It can warn us that an animal may attack, that a person is dangerous, that a cliff edge is real. A spirituality that teaches people to override all fear is irresponsible. But fear can also become the guardian of identity. The person is not merely afraid, something bad may happen. They are afraid. If I cross this boundary, I may cease to be the person I know myself to be. This is often deeper. The respectable person fears disgrace because their identity depends upon respectability. The Orthodox believer fears doctrinal contamination because the forbidden thought threatens spiritual belonging. The ascetic may fear pleasure because pleasure threatens the identity of the renouncer. The radical transgressor may eventually fear ordinary convention because ordinariness threatens the identity of being beyond convention. The guru may fear criticism because criticism threatens the identity of realized authority. Here, the object of fear has shifted from physical danger to psychic continuity. Transgressive practice becomes particularly powerful wherever exclusion is protecting identity. If I approach this, who will I become? Sometimes this question reveals why the boundary carries so much force. It is not the substance, person, place, or act alone that terrifies consciousness. It is the possibility that the encounter will redraw the map of the self. This is why transgressive-transformative consciousness often appears drawn toward charged thresholds. The forbidden object seems to radiate information. The boundary calls attention to itself. Why so much energy here? Why this disgust? Why this shame? Why does this possibility have to remain unthinkable? Why is this person placed outside? Why must holiness look like this and never like that? Why does the spiritual community need this distinction so badly? Why does my own identity require it? This questioning can be exceptionally penetrating, but it also contains one of the mode's first dangers. The transgressive personality may begin to assume that whatever carries charge must therefore be spiritually valuable. That does not follow. A boundary may be charged because the object is genuinely dangerous. A trauma trigger may be charged because the nervous system was overwhelmed. A sexual boundary may be charged because the person does not want contact. A prohibition may carry wisdom rather than repression. The presence of charge tells us investigate. It does not automatically tell us cross. This distinction is one of the marks separating mature transgression from compulsive antinomianism. The immature transgressor sees a wall and wants to break it. The mature practitioner first asks what the wall is doing. Does it protect life? Does it hold together a developmental capacity still under construction? Does it preserve another person's autonomy? Does it merely defend inherited identity? Does it encode historical prejudice? Does it contain fear that has never been examined? Does it restrain a genuine compulsion? Does it protect the practitioner from material for which they are not yet ready? Only then does the question of crossing arise. The spiritual operation is therefore not boundary destruction. It is boundary discernment followed, where appropriate, by transformation of the contraction invested in the boundary. That is far less glamorous. It is also far more demanding. The relationship between asceticism and transgression becomes clearest here. Ascetic consciousness learns not to equate arising with necessity. Desire appears. The practitioner does not obey. Anger appears. The practitioner does not automatically discharge it. Comfort is available. The practitioner discovers that comfort need not dictate action. Something gradually becomes free. But every successful discipline creates a possibility of its own absolutization. The person who learns, I do not need this, may gradually begin to believe, this must never touch me. Restraint becomes distance. Distance becomes purity. Purity becomes identity. Identity becomes metaphysics. What began as medicine becomes another knot. At that point, the transgressive question appears. Are you free enough not only to refuse the object, but also to encounter it without losing yourself? This is why the transition between the two modes is so subtle. The transgressive mode is not a rebellion against asceticism. Without the capacity developed by asceticism, transgression easily becomes indistinguishable from appetite. The person must be able to say no before yes carries much spiritual meaning. One can meaningfully transgress only a boundary one is capable of keeping. Otherwise, the act may simply express incapacity to refrain. Someone unable to abstain from sex cannot demonstrate freedom through sexual transgression. Someone unable to abstain from intoxication cannot prove liberation through drinking. Someone addicted to scandal cannot establish independence through breaking convention. In this sense, asceticism provides the containment through which transgression becomes possible. But the reverse is also true. Containment that can never permit encounter may harden into avoidance. Transgression without containment becomes appetite. Containment without the possibility of integration becomes fear. The two modes expose different tyrannies. Asceticism asks whether desire can command us. Transgression asks whether aversion can command us. Asceticism says, not everything that arises deserves obedience. Transgression replies, not everything that arises deserves exile. Together, they reveal something larger. Freedom is neither enactment nor suppression, neither indulgence nor purity, neither permanent approach nor permanent withdrawal. The deeper possibility is consciousness capable of meeting what arises without being compelled by either attraction or recoil. At its most mature, therefore, the transgressive-transformative mode does not seek a world without distinctions. It seeks a consciousness in which distinction no longer requires contraction. A person may still say, no, not now, not for me. This is dangerous. This would harm someone. This practice is inappropriate. This relationship must end. This substance should not be consumed. This tradition is not mine. This behavior is unacceptable. None of these judgments contradict non-duality. The decisive question is whether the judgment requires the object to become metaphysically exiled. One may refuse something without needing to declare it outside reality. One may establish a boundary without hatred. One may leave without contempt. One may protect oneself without constructing pollution. One may acknowledge desire without obeying it. One may recognize disgust without enthroning it as truth. This is why the mature fruit cannot be called simple boundarylessness. Boundarylessness is too crude. The transgressive-transformative mode seeks something more difficult. Discrimination without contraction. Its path may begin with the forbidden because the forbidden reveals where consciousness remains divided against itself. But the forbidden is never the final destination. The real destination is freedom from the hidden necessity that one side of the boundary must remain unreal, impure, unbearable, or excluded in order for the self to survive. The boundary may remain, the contraction need not. And once that becomes possible, transgression itself begins to change meaning. It is no longer the heroic act of crossing what others fear. It becomes a much quieter capacity to stand before what once compelled either approach or recoil, to see clearly and to discover that neither movement is inevitable. What this mode is not. One of the oldest confusions surrounding transgressive spirituality is the assumption that rejecting repression means affirming appetite. It does not. The person who says, desire is evil, therefore I must suppress it, and the person who says, desire is divine, therefore I must obey it, may appear to stand at opposite extremes, yet both grant desire enormous authority. The first organizes life around resisting it, the second organizes life around fulfilling it. The transgressive mode at maturity requires something more difficult. Desire may be admitted fully into consciousness without being either demonized or obeyed automatically. This is where the distinction from the ascetic mode remains crucial. Asceticism has already established, not everything that arises deserves obedience. Transgression adds, not everything that arises deserves exile. Neither statement cancels the other. A desire may arise. It may be acknowledged without shame. Its bodily force may be felt. Its imagery may be allowed to become conscious. Its roots may be understood. And still the appropriate action may be, no, this does not make the desire impure. It means desire is not sovereign. The opposite is equally possible. A person may discover that a desire was previously rejected only because it threatened an inherited identity, and after examination, there may be no compelling reason not to act upon it. The point is not abstention. The point is not fulfillment. The point is freedom. That is why formulations such as all desires are divine become dangerous when treated carelessly. One may say, within a non-dual metaphysics, that no arising occurs outside consciousness, but this does not imply that every arising expresses realized freedom. Trauma arises within consciousness. Compulsion arises within consciousness. Addiction arises within consciousness, rage arises within consciousness, grandiosity arises within consciousness, the desire to possess another human being arises within consciousness. None has therefore become spiritually normative. Nothing arises outside consciousness, but not every arising expresses freedom. Without that distinction, non duality becomes a theology of impulse, and transgression becomes merely indulgence with metaphysical language added afterward. This counterfeit deserves special attention because it often looks sophisticated. A practitioner already wants something, perhaps sexual novelty, perhaps intoxication, perhaps admiration, perhaps exemption from ordinary responsibility, perhaps the excitement of violating taboos. Then they encounter a teaching that tells them this is not lower desire, this is Shakti, this is spontaneity, this is freedom from conditioning, this is sacred transgression, this is the refusal of bourgeois morality. Nothing fundamental has necessarily changed. The appetite has simply acquired a more prestigious description. If an act leaves existing compulsions intact and merely gives them sacred justification, it has not become transformative transgression. This does not mean that spiritual practice must always oppose what one enjoys. Pleasure is not evidence against realization. Enjoyment is not inherently suspicious. But practice that consistently confirms the practitioner's existing preferences deserves examination. If someone who already seeks sexual multiplicity discovers that liberation requires sexual multiplicity, one may reasonably ask whether anything has actually been surrendered. If someone who dislikes institutions discovers that enlightenment consists in rejecting institutions, perhaps insight has occurred. But perhaps personality has simply found metaphysics willing to agree with it. The test is not whether the conclusion is pleasant or unpleasant. It is whether reality has been allowed to contradict the practitioner. That question should remain active throughout the entire mode. Can reality still correct me here? If not, transgression has already begun to seal itself. Another dangerous confusion occurs when the disappearance of inhibition is mistaken for the disappearance of bondage. They are not the same. Alcohol can remove inhibition. Certain drugs can remove inhibition. Mania can remove inhibition. Group pressure can remove inhibition. Trauma can disrupt inhibition. Charismatic persuasion can remove inhibition. Erotic excitement can remove inhibition. A person may suddenly do what they previously considered unthinkable. But this tells us almost nothing about whether consciousness became freer. They may simply have become less capable of regulating themselves. The distinction is especially important because many transgressive practices deliberately operate near powerful bodily and emotional forces. Fear, sexual arousal, intoxication, shame, disgust, social exposure, these can produce dramatic states, but intensity is not itself transformation. A practitioner may leave such an experience exhilarated, disoriented, euphoric, shocked, or temporarily free from ordinary self-consciousness. None of that establishes that the deeper contraction has dissolved. The aftermath matters. Does the person become less compelled, less frightened, less fascinated, less dependent upon repetition, more capable of clarity, more capable of restraint, more able to meet the formerly forbidden object without either craving or recoil? If not, the practice may have merely altered state. Loss of inhibition is not liberation. This distinction is one reason the Kaula emphasis on fitness and containment matters so much. The purpose is not simply to overwhelm the mechanism of hesitation, it is to transform what produces the hesitation. A person rendered incapable of recoil by intoxication has not necessarily recognized anything. A person who acts recklessly because the group has dissolved their ordinary caution has not transcended fear. A person pressured into sexual contact has not achieved freedom from sexual conditioning. A nervous system can be overrun. That is not the same as liberation. Not rebellion. This is perhaps the most common psychological counterfeit. Conformity and rebellion look opposite, but psychologically they can be mirror images. The conformist asks, what does the rule require? The compulsive rebel asks, what does the rule forbid? Then performs the opposite. In both cases, the rule remains the organizing center. One obeys positively, the other obeys negatively. Compulsive nonconformity is conformity with the sign reversed. This is why rebellion can initially be liberating and later become imprisoning. A person raised under suffocating control may genuinely require rebellion. They may need to say no, leave, reject inherited authority, experiment, cross a boundary that has been treated as absolute. That movement can be psychologically necessary. But if the identity remains, I am the one who does not obey, then freedom has not yet matured. The rebel still needs the authority they reject. Without an enemy, their identity begins to collapse. This is particularly visible in spiritual subcultures organized around being: anti-religious, anti-monastic, anti-moralistic, anti-bourgeois, anti-traditional, anti-modern, anti-institutional. Opposition gives coherence. The practitioner knows who they are because they know what they refuse to resemble. But this is still dependence. The rebel who must remain outside the boundary is no freer than the conformist who must remain inside it. Mature transgression must eventually permit both possibilities. One may break a convention because it is false. One may follow the same convention tomorrow because it is useful. Neither action needs to become identity. This will later become one of the mature fruits of the mode, reversible freedom. Not sexual liberation. Sex deserves particular attention because modern Western and globalized representations of Tantra have so strongly identified transgression with sexuality. Sex can certainly become transgressive material. It is one of the most powerful human domains for shame, purity, identity, possession, fear, desire, social hierarchy, gender expectation, jealousy, vulnerability, and bodily inhibition. For this reason, tantric traditions sometimes use sexual ritual with enormous precision. But this does not mean that sexual expansion is the telos of Tantra. Learning to communicate sexually, becoming comfortable with one's body, healing sexual shame, learning consent, exploring preference, improving intimacy, experimenting with relationship structures, all of these can be valuable forms of human development, but they are not identical with the transgressive-transformative operation. One can become sexually healthy without entering a transgressive spiritual path. One can also become sexually adventurous while remaining deeply unfree. A person may accumulate experiences and call this liberation while becoming increasingly dependent upon novelty, validation, conquest, or erotic attention. The important distinction is sexual development work seeks a healthier sexuality. Transgressive spirituality uses sexuality, where appropriate, as one possible charged field in which a deeper contraction can become visible. These aims may overlap. They should not be confused. The sexual act is not spiritually profound merely because a tradition calls it tantric, and sexual conservatism is not spiritually immature merely because a transgressive tradition exists. The question remains, what is actually being transformed? Not the destruction of morality or every boundary. Another confusion arises from non-dual language. If purity and impurity are not ultimate properties of things, does good and evil also disappear? If all phenomena arise within one reality, does moral judgment become ignorance? If an awakened person has gone beyond duality, can their actions still be called harmful? This is precisely where metaphysical language can become dangerous. A distinction must be made between ultimate non-exclusion and conventional consequence. An act does not fall outside reality merely because it harms, but the fact that it belongs to reality does not make the harm disappear. A lie remains capable of deception. A blow remains capable of injury. Sexual coercion remains coercion. Humiliation remains capable of psychological damage. Pregnancy remains a biological possibility. Addiction has consequences. Power asymmetry matters. Other people remain centers of experience rather than symbolic objects in one's spiritual experiment. Therefore, non dual metaphysics does not abolish consequence, and the fact that a boundary is socially constructed does not make another person's boundary spiritually disposable. A practitioner may discover that inherited sexual morality is contingent. That discovery does not permit them to reinterpret another person's refusal as spiritual ignorance. A teacher may regard jealousy as conditioned. That does not entitle the teacher to impose an erotic arrangement upon a disciple. A tradition may relativize ritual pollution. That does not relativize consent. This distinction needs to remain unambiguous. Transgressive spirituality may relativize purity codes. It does not thereby relativize consent, nor does it make responsibility obsolete. If an act generates consequences for another person, the practitioner's spiritual interpretation does not remove those consequences. Freedom without responsibility is not transcendence, it is often merely privilege. Because transgressive traditions work with boundaries, they can easily produce a dangerous simplification. Boundaries imprison, therefore, freedom means crossing boundaries. This is false. Boundaries perform different functions. Before asking whether a boundary should be crossed, one must first ask, what kind of boundary is this? Protective boundaries. Some boundaries protect bodily or psychological integrity, consent, distance from an abusive person, medical restrictions, protection from substances likely to produce harm, limits imposed because someone is exhausted, traumatized, ill, or vulnerable. These boundaries are not merely manifestations of spiritual contraction, they may be intelligent responses to reality. The desire to transgress them can itself become violence. A particularly dangerous guru logic appears when protective boundaries are redescribed as spiritual resistance. Your fear proves you need this. Your refusal is ego. Your discomfort means the practice is working. This reverses the direction of discernment. A spiritual practice should not require the practitioner to treat every protective response as illusion. Developmental boundaries. Other boundaries are temporary forms of training. The novice abstains because the capacity to remain free in proximity has not yet developed. The beginning meditator follows structure. The recovering addict avoids a substance. The renunciate limits stimulation. The practitioner establishes a vow. Such rules can function like scaffolding. A later stage may no longer require them. But removing scaffolding before the structure can stand is not liberation. This is why qualification matters. A practice appropriate to a mature practitioner may be destructive to someone earlier in development, and the reverse also occurs. A discipline once necessary can later become another attachment. The person becomes afraid that freedom itself depends upon permanent restriction. Thus, developmental boundaries have to remain responsive to reality. They are neither eternally binding nor automatically obsolete. Conventional boundaries. No. These are especially fertile territory for transgression. Dress, food conventions, caste rules, purity expectations, gendered social roles, religious decorum, status hierarchies, ideas of respectable behavior. Some conventions protect social coordination, others carry accumulated prejudice, fear, historical contingency, or arbitrary notions of pollution. Here, the transgressive mode can be exceptionally incisive. It asks, why exactly is this prohibited? What would actually happen if the distinction disappeared? Who benefits from maintaining it, whose humanity becomes invisible because of it? But even here, mature practice does not assume that every convention must be violated. The purpose is to see whether convention has become metaphysics. Identity boundaries. These may be the deepest of all. A person constructs a self partly through negation. I am not one of those people. I would never do that. Someone like me cannot feel this. A holy person could not experience such a thought. A man must not be this. A woman must not desire that. A spiritual teacher cannot appear weak. An intellectual cannot believe this. A renunciate cannot enjoy that. These boundaries can remain invisible precisely because they feel like identity rather than prohibition. When challenged, the reaction can be enormous, because what seems threatened is not merely a rule, it is the continuity of self. Transgressive practice becomes especially powerful wherever exclusion is serving identity, but it must also be especially careful there. Identity can sometimes dissolve fruitfully. It can also destabilize a person who lacks the capacity to integrate what appears afterward. Again, power is not automatically wisdom. Charge is an invitation to investigate, not a command to cross. This distinction may be the simplest safeguard of the entire mode. Something produces intense fear, or disgust, or shame, or fascination. The immature transgressor concludes, there, that is exactly what I must do, but the presence of charge does not tell us what the appropriate action is. It tells us that something deserves examination. The charge may reveal unconscious prejudice, unprocessed trauma, genuine danger, social conditioning, sexual shame, a buried desire, a protective instinct, narcissistic vulnerability, an inherited spiritual prohibition, or simply lack of readiness. These require very different responses. Sometimes the appropriate movement is direct encounter, sometimes gradual exposure, sometimes intellectual investigation, sometimes symbolic ritual, sometimes compassionate relationship, sometimes distance, sometimes nothing at all. The intensity of the method should correspond to the depth and nature of the contraction, not to the practitioner's need to prove radicality. This is where the transgressive mode becomes mature. It no longer assumes that courage means crossing. Sometimes courage means approaching, sometimes remaining, sometimes refusing, sometimes leaving. The world from within. To understand the transgressive transformative mode from within, one has to suspend the assumption that the practitioner is simply attracted to what is forbidden. Often the attraction is not pleasure, it is charge. Something about the prohibited object, forbidden space, socially rejected person, or impossible thought seems to contain an unusual density of psychic energy. The boundary itself becomes visible. Most people encounter a prohibition and experience its meaning as obvious. Do not go there, do not touch this, do not think that, do not become this kind of person. The transgressive consciousness notices something else. Why is so much force required to keep this outside? Why does the body tighten? Why does the mind recoil? Why does shame appear before anything has happened? Why does disgust arrive so quickly? Why does one possibility seem capable of contaminating an entire identity? The forbidden thing begins to function almost like a diagnostic instrument. It reveals where consciousness has concentrated fear, and because fear has concentrated there, attention is drawn there, not necessarily in order to possess the forbidden object. Not necessarily even to cross the boundary, but because the boundary seems to conceal something. The transgressive intuition is that wherever consciousness says, under no circumstances, this there may be a structure worth examining. Fear, disgust, and identity. Fear is one of the clearest examples. Fear can protect life. That must never be forgotten. A person who approaches every dangerous situation in order to prove spiritual freedom is not liberated. They may simply lack judgment, but there is another form of fear whose function is less obvious. The practitioner feels that an encounter would not merely hurt, it would contaminate, degrade, expose, unmake. The feared object threatens not only safety but identity. Then the question becomes, what exactly am I afraid will disappear if this boundary is crossed? Sometimes the answer is surprisingly small: respectability, an image of being pure, a religious role, a gender identity, a political identity, a reputation for being rational, a spiritual self-conception. The fear may be less about the object than about what the object reveals. The practitioner discovers, I am not protecting life here, I am protecting a picture of myself. That is precisely the kind of discovery this mode seeks. Disgust is even more revealing. It may begin with biology, rot, waste, disease, contamination. But disgust is unusually easy to moralize. A person becomes disgusting, a caste becomes polluting, a body becomes shameful, a sexual practice becomes filthy, a disease becomes associated with moral failure, a group becomes untouchable. At that point, the nervous system is no longer merely protecting the organism, it has become the carrier of a world view. The body recoils before the intellect has time to explain why. This is one reason traditions like Agora are so important for understanding the transgressive mode. The cremation ground confronts death, bodily dissolution, pollution, fear, and the destruction of social identity all at once. But the deeper principle does not depend on cremation grounds. The same operation may occur when a practitioner approaches a person whom society has rendered untouchable. The dying, the diseased, the disfigured, the socially abandoned, the person whose body makes others uncomfortable, the person associated with moral contamination. Here, transgression can become profoundly ethical. The question is no longer, can I break this taboo? It becomes, can I remain present where my conditioning tells me to recoil? That is a much more serious practice. The deepest boundaries often concern identity. Every person has categories that organize the self. I am this. I am not that. I belong here. I could never become that kind of person. These categories are necessary to some extent. Without them, ordinary life becomes incoherent. But identity becomes rigid when the excluded category acquires emotional charge disproportionate to reality. The person cannot merely disagree with something, they must distance themselves from it absolutely. They cannot merely refuse an act, They must insist that someone like them could never even desire it. They cannot merely reject a worldview. They need those who hold it to be psychologically or morally alien. This is where the boundary begins to reveal dependence. The excluded other has become necessary to the self. I know who I am because I know what I could never be. The transgressive mode senses the fragility hidden inside this certainty. If identity depends upon permanent exclusion, then the forbidden category carries unusual power. It can threaten the self simply by becoming psychologically imaginable. This is why transgressive practice sometimes appears to attack identity directly, not because identity is evil, but because certain identities survive only through continuous refusal to acknowledge what lies outside them. The energy required to keep something outside. There's also a subtler boundary that appears later in spiritual development. A person may become deeply attached to being unusual, a yogin, a radical, a visionary, a renunciate, a teacher, a transgressor, a person who sees what others cannot see. Then ordinary life itself becomes threatening. A conventional job, a quiet relationship, regular family duties, simple clothes, predictable routine, no disciples, no visible spiritual identity. The transgressive personality may initially reject respectable convention because convention is genuinely suffocating. Later, however, it may become unable to return to ordinary form. Now the polarity has reversed. Ordinariness has become the forbidden object. This reveals something important. Whatever must remain outside identity still possesses power, even when the excluded thing is convention itself. Thus, the mature transgressive mode eventually has to confront not only taboo, but the taboo against normality. This becomes especially important in traditions of holy foolishness, avaduta life, and radical anti institutional spirituality. The person who cannot tolerate appearing ordinary is still captured by appearance. This is one of the most important phenomenological insights of the mode. Maintaining exclusion requires work. The person must constantly monitor thought, body, speech, social affiliation, fantasy, desire, reputation. Certain possibilities cannot be allowed to arise. Certain associations must be rejected immediately. Certain emotions must be reclassified before they become conscious. This produces a kind of internal border police. The mind patrols itself. The person may appear highly disciplined, but enormous energy is being spent maintaining a division. When the division relaxes, the person can experience a surprising release. Not necessarily pleasure, often simply relief. The psychic resources previously used to suppress, monitor, condemn, or distance become available for something else. This may be one reason transgressive practices can sometimes produce a sense of sudden expansion. The energy was already there. It was bound in maintaining the border. When the border loses metaphysical necessity, that energy is released. This helps explain why some transgressive traditions speak in language of power. The power is not necessarily contained in the forbidden substance itself. It may lie partly in the force consciousness had invested in excluding it. The boundary stores energy because consciousness continuously feeds it. When contraction dissolves, the energy need not disappear, it becomes available. This is why the forbidden object often functions more like a mirror than a treasure. It shows the practitioner their own structure. The corpse reveals fear of impermanence. The outcast reveals disgust and social conditioning. The sexual taboo reveals shame or identity. The insult reveals attachment to reputation. The broken ritual rule reveals fear of impurity. The disrespectful disciple reveals the guru's attachment to authority. The ordinary job reveals the radical practitioner's attachment to exceptionality. The boundary is useful because it reflects what consciousness cannot yet hold. In this sense, the transgressive path is less about collecting forbidden experiences than about discovering, what does this boundary reveal about me? That question is more powerful than, how do I cross it? Because once the structure becomes visible, literal transgression may or may not be necessary. When spirituality becomes too sanitized. There is also a characteristic perception found in some primary transgressive personalities. Ordinary spiritual environments can feel strangely sanitized, too clean, too controlled, too respectable, too conceptually settled. The practitioner feels that important dimensions of human reality have been excluded from spirituality in order to preserve an image of purity. Sexuality is spoken about abstractly. Death is ritualized but kept at distance. Aggression is denied rather than understood. Shame is hidden. Power is spiritualized. Madness is excluded. The body is tolerated only when it behaves. The practitioner senses that the sacred has been made too small. This can generate a powerful impulse toward traditions that seem willing to include what others exclude. Kaula, Agora, certain Vajrayana forms, holy madness, sacred fool traditions, Avaduta paths. They appear to say, nothing human has to be removed before reality can be encountered. That message can be liberating, especially for people who have suffered under highly purified religious identities. But it carries a danger. The practitioner can begin to assume that dirtier, darker, more sexual, more violent, more outrageous spirituality is therefore more authentic. Then the mode becomes aesthetic. Darkness itself acquires prestige. The person prefers skulls to flowers not because skulls expose contraction, but because skulls feel more radical. At that point, transgression has become style. Not everyone experiences charged boundaries in the same way. For some people, prohibition produces caution. For others, it produces curiosity. For others, fascination. For some primary transgressive personalities, the boundary itself seems almost to announce something important is hidden here. This can be temperament. It can also emerge from biography. A person raised under rigid moral control may become highly sensitive to hidden prohibitions. Someone who has experienced exclusion may notice mechanisms of purity and pollution more sharply. Someone with strong sensitivity to hypocrisy may be drawn toward traditions that expose the gap between public holiness and hidden desire. Someone naturally fearless around social norms may experience boundary crossing as intuitive rather than dramatic. But none of these automatically makes the person spiritually mature. The same temperament that makes transgressive insight possible can also produce recklessness, rebellious identity, boundary testing, romanticization of danger, or contempt for slower forms of practice. Therefore, the primary configuration itself carries both gift and risk. Its gift is extraordinary sensitivity to what a culture or spiritual system cannot tolerate. Its danger is the assumption that whatever cannot be tolerated must therefore be crossed. From forbidden object to living threshold. Eventually, the question deepens. At first, what is forbidden? Then, why is it forbidden? Then, what happens in me when I approach it? Then, what is this boundary protecting? Then, does this protection still serve life? And finally, can this boundary remain without governing consciousness? That is the mature question. The goal is not necessarily to remove the wall, it is to discover whether the wall still possesses the power to define reality. This is why the highest expression of the mode may look much quieter than its beginning. The practitioner no longer needs to hunt for forbidden objects. Life itself continually presents boundaries: criticism, failure, aging, illness, sexual desire, disappointment, loss of status, parenthood, ordinary work, dependence, vulnerability, the possibility of being wrong, the possibility of being unknown. These can become more transgressive than any ritual substance. A teacher who has become incapable of hearing criticism may need that encounter more than another esoteric rite. A radical practitioner obsessed with freedom may need responsibility more than further rebellion. A person attached to spiritual exceptionalism may need anonymity. A renunciate attached to purity may need ordinary human intimacy. The correct support changes because the knot changes. The effective transgression is always relative to the actual bondage. This is why no external inventory of transgressive acts can define the mode. Seen from within this mode, life begins to appear as a landscape of thresholds. Some are inherited from culture, some from religion, some from trauma, some from biology, some from personal identity, some from genuine ethical intelligence. The practitioner does not flatten them, they learn to read them. Where is the charge? Where is the contraction? Where is the fascination? Where is the fear? What requires distance? What requires approach? What requires patience? What requires refusal? What requires a direct confrontation? This is a demanding form of spirituality because it offers fewer absolute rules than either conformity or rebellion. The conformist knows, do not cross. The rebel knows, cross. The mature transgressive practitioner has to remain with the more difficult question: what does freedom require here? Sometimes freedom requires leaving the boundary intact, sometimes stepping close enough to see that it was never absolute, sometimes crossing it, sometimes returning afterward. The discernment itself becomes the practice. And this is where the mode begins to move beyond fascination with the forbidden toward its real operation. Not the conquest of taboo, but the transformation of the consciousness that created the taboo's power. The central operation and the mature fruit. The transgressive transformative mode does not begin with crossing, it begins with recognition. Something has become charged, a boundary that may once have been practical, cultural, protective, developmental, or symbolic has acquired disproportionate psychological force. Consciousness does not merely distinguish one side from another, it contracts before the possibility of contact. The central operation of this mode is therefore not break the rule, it is find the contraction, approach it with sufficient clarity and containment, and remain present until the boundary loses the power to define reality. Sometimes this process is gradual, sometimes it can be astonishingly rapid. A single encounter may expose a distinction that had silently governed consciousness for years. A ritual act may suddenly reveal that what had seemed intrinsically impure was held in place by conditioning. A conversation with someone previously despised may collapse an inherited social boundary. A confrontation with death may dissolve a structure of avoidance. A moment of public humiliation may reveal how deeply spiritual identity depended upon being admired. But the intensity of the event is not the operation itself. The operation is what happens to the contraction. This distinction matters because transgressive traditions have often preserved dramatic forms while losing clarity about the mechanism. The forbidden object survives, the ritual survives, the scandal survives, but the question quietly disappears. What exactly is being transformed? To recover the mode, the operation must be followed from beginning to end. Approach and containment. The characteristic movement of the mode begins here. Instead of automatically withdrawing, consciousness turns toward what had previously required distance. This is the defining reversal, but approach does not necessarily mean enactment. The practitioner may begin by thinking about the forbidden object without immediately suppressing the thought, remaining physically near what previously produced avoidance, allowing a previously shameful feeling to become fully conscious, speaking honestly about a taboo, entering relationship with someone previously excluded, contemplating mortality, approaching a ritual symbol, accepting criticism that threatens spiritual identity, or, in some traditions and circumstances, directly entering a transgressive rite. The external intensity varies enormously. The common operation is simple. What previously required automatic withdrawal is now met consciously. That alone can be profoundly difficult. The mind discovers how quickly explanation arises, the body tightens, the old moral vocabulary appears, the practitioner wants to escape or to rush forward and prove courage. Both reactions can obscure the process. The mature approach is neither retreat nor assault, it is sustained contact. This is the point at which the transgressive mode reveals its deep dependence upon capacities associated with asceticism. The practitioner must remain capable of not acting, otherwise, transgression becomes impossible to distinguish from compulsion. This is perhaps one of the most important principles of the entire mode. One can meaningfully transgress only a boundary one is capable of keeping. Someone who cannot refrain from a sexual act cannot establish freedom by performing it. Someone unable to abstain from alcohol cannot prove transgressive realization through drinking. Someone who habitually humiliates others cannot call another act of humiliation sacred because it took place in a ritual setting. Someone unable to tolerate ordinary life cannot prove transcendence by remaining unconventional. The capacity to refrain creates space in which the act can acquire meaning. Without that space, behavior follows necessity. Containment means that the practitioner can feel desire, fear, disgust, excitement, shame, fascination, and still remain capable of choosing. This is why traditional transgressive paths so often surround dangerous practices with initiation, qualification, vows, ritual structure, guru supervision, preliminary discipline, and strict context. Those structures can certainly themselves become abusive or ossified, but their existence reflects a genuine insight. High voltage practices require containment because the forces they engage are capable of overwhelming discernment. Without containment, the practitioner does not transform the boundary. The boundary may instead sweep the practitioner away. Encounter, recognition, and the dissolution of charge. Eventually, the practice must reach the actual knot, This is where purely theoretical transgression fails. A person may say, I no longer believe this is impure, good. But if direct proximity still produces the same overwhelming contraction, the work has reached only one layer. The encounter does not always require literal performance of the prohibited act, but it must be deep enough that the old structure cannot simply survive untouched behind a new philosophy. This distinction is subtle. A person may no longer regard homosexuality as impure without ever engaging in homosexual behavior. No enactment is needed. But if they still cannot sit beside a same-sex couple without disgust, something remains unresolved. A person may no longer consider alcohol metaphysically polluting while choosing never to drink. No contradiction exists. But if even seeing another practitioner use wine ritually produces panic, the intellectual revision may not have reached the deeper conditioning. The encounter therefore has to be calibrated to the knot. Sometimes thought is enough, sometimes relationship, sometimes symbolic ritual, sometimes direct sensory contact, sometimes embodied transgression, sometimes nothing further is required because the contraction has genuinely dissolved already. The practice cannot be standardized because the bondage is not standardized. This is the moment when the object begins to lose its metaphysical status. Something becomes obvious, not necessarily intellectually new. Often the practitioner knew it before, but now it becomes embodied. This too exists within reality. The corpse is still a corpse. The sexual substance is still a sexual substance. The forbidden thought is still a thought. The socially rejected person remains different from oneself in countless ways. Nothing has to become pleasant. Nothing has to become desirable. But the sense that the object inhabits a metaphysical outside begins to fail. In the Kaula language, the distinction no longer produces the same contraction of difference. The practitioner discovers, I can distinguish without making the distinction absolute. That is the crucial recognition. The mode does not destroy differentiation. It removes the necessity that one side of a distinction be excluded from sacred reality. If recognition is genuine, something usually happens to the charge. It weakens. The object may remain important, but it loses the strange density it once possessed. Fear no longer arrives with the same force. Disgust may still occur biologically without becoming moral judgment. Shame becomes less automatic. Fascination decreases. The practitioner does not need to keep returning to the object in order to prove freedom. This is one of the best indicators of successful transformation. The object becomes less spiritually special. This may seem paradoxical because transgressive practices often begin by intensifying contact with the forbidden. But the purpose is not to make the forbidden permanently sacred. It is to end the exceptional status created by exclusion. If 20 years later the practitioner still needs the same forbidden object to feel spiritually alive, the operation may have become stuck. The taboo has been crossed, but its glamour remains. Integration, inclusion without permission. The mature transformation does not end with the collapse of prohibition. The previously excluded material must become integrated into a wider field of consciousness. This is where the path distinguishes itself from both suppression and acting out. The practitioner can now say, this exists. A violent fantasy can exist without becoming violence. Sexual desire can exist without requiring enactment. Disgust can arise without determining metaphysics. Envy can be recognized without needing to become self-condemnation or action. A socially forbidden possibility can be considered without immediately restructuring life around it. This capacity is extraordinarily important. What is admitted into consciousness no longer has to be either enacted or expelled. This may be one of the deepest mature fruits of the mode. The immature binary is, if this is bad, repress it. Or, if repression is bad, express it. Mature consciousness discovers a third possibility. Contain it consciously. Allow it. Know it. Understand it. Choose. This is freedom far more than disinhibition. This distinction deserves emphasis because transgressive spirituality can otherwise become ethically incoherent. To include something in consciousness does not mean granting it behavioral permission. A person can include anger. This does not authorize assault. They can include sexual desire. This does not override another person's consent. They can include fantasies of revenge. This does not transform revenge into sacred action. They can recognize their capacity for cruelty. This may actually make ethical responsibility stronger because denial no longer protects the self-image. Thus, nothing needs to be exiled in order for conduct to remain discriminating. In fact, repression can sometimes make conduct less intelligent. The person who insists, "I have no desire for power," may remain much more governed by power than the person who can say, "Yes, I feel that desire. Now what will I do with it?" Transgressive inclusion can therefore deepen ethics rather than dissolve it. The person sees more of what is actually present. The opposite side is equally important. The fact that something has been reintegrated does not create an obligation to express it. A previously forbidden desire may become conscious. It can remain unacted. A disowned aggression may be acknowledged. It does not need to become violence. A part of identity previously rejected may be accepted without becoming the center of one's life. Thus, the mature fruit can be described as inclusion without compulsion. Nothing must be expelled, nothing must therefore be enacted. This is one of the points at which the transgressive and ascetic modes become mutually illuminating rather than antagonistic. Asceticism gives the capacity to refrain, transgression gives the capacity to include. Together, I can encounter what I do not obey and contain what I do not enact. That is a much more complete form of freedom than either suppression or indulgence. Conceptual, affective, and embodied freedom. It can be useful to distinguish three levels. Conceptual permission. The worldview changes. This is not intrinsically impure. This is not outside reality. This does not automatically make someone degraded. This can be an important beginning, but it may remain intellectual. Affective freedom. The nervous system changes. The object can be contemplated, discussed, seen, or approached without overwhelming shame, disgust, fear, or fascination. This is deeper. The body's relationship to the boundary has shifted. Embodied freedom, where relevant, direct proximity or participation can occur without collapse, compulsion, or loss of discernment. This is a strong test in some circumstances, but it is not a universal requirement. A practitioner does not need to accumulate embodied experiences merely to complete a theoretical ladder. The appropriate depth depends upon the actual contraction. This leads to one of the central principles of the mode. The proof of freedom is not that the act occurred. It is that neither performing nor refusing the act is dictated by contraction. This is where the mode moves beyond antinomianism. The immature practitioner seeks proof through violation. The mature practitioner no longer needs proof. They can cross the boundary, or not cross it. Both remain available. The object no longer dictates behavior, either positively or negatively. This is the beginning of reversible freedom. Reversible freedom and the capacity to return. This may be the deepest mature fruit of the transgressive-transformative mode. Freedom is not established by standing permanently outside convention. That would merely create another fixed position. It is established when consciousness can move according to reality rather than identity. The practitioner can observe a ritual rule when it serves, break it when it has become empty, remain celibate without fearing sexuality, enter sexuality without worshipping it, live anonymously without turning invisibility into pride, become visible when responsibility requires it, accept social respect without depending upon it, survive disgrace without seeking disgrace, live inside an institution without being owned by it, leave an institution without needing to despise it, practice austerity without fearing pleasure, encounter pleasure without becoming its servant. This is far more demanding than simple rebellion. Freedom includes the ability to conform without becoming conformist and to transgress without becoming a transgressor. The polarity loses its grip. The practitioner no longer needs one side in order to reject the other. One of the strongest tests of transgressive realization is therefore surprisingly conservative in appearance. Can the practitioner return? Can someone who has broken convention live ordinarily again? Can the sacred fool stop performing foolishness? Can the radical sexual practitioner enter a stable relationship without experiencing stability as imprisonment? Can the anti-institutional mystic accept responsibility inside an institution? Can the renunciate eat a pleasant meal without imagining that their realization is endangered? Can the transgressive teacher follow an ordinary ethical norm without feeling spiritually diminished? If not, then convention still possesses power. The person remains bound negatively. This is where the maturity of the mode becomes visible. The ability to violate a boundary may demonstrate courage. The ability to return across it without losing freedom demonstrates integration. That distinction is crucial. The mode can therefore reach a point where its own characteristic operation must be relinquished. The practitioner may become accustomed to intensity. A forbidden object no longer produces the same charge, so another is sought, then another. The person becomes a collector of thresholds, but this endless search reveals that transgression itself has become necessary. The practitioner cannot feel spiritually alive without encountering another boundary. At this point, the path has reversed. The person is no longer using transgression. Transgression is using them. The mature fruit requires the ability to stop, to allow ordinary experience to become enough, to encounter no particular taboo, to live without spiritual drama. This is one reason the highest expression of the mode may look surprisingly simple. Freedom from the witness and the need to appear radical. The Malamati tradition reveals another dimension of this maturity. A person may overcome ordinary attachment to praise while developing a subtler attachment. I want to be known as someone beyond praise. The renunciate wants others to see their renunciation. The radical wants others to recognize radicality. The humble practitioner becomes proud of humility. The transgressor needs witnesses. The act derives part of its energy from being seen. At this stage, the social gaze itself becomes the charged boundary. A deeper practice asks, would this still matter if nobody knew? This can be devastating. If the answer is no, perhaps the real object was reputation all along. The mature fruit becomes freedom from the need for one's spiritual identity to be mirrored socially. This does not require permanent anonymity. That too can become an identity. The deeper freedom is, my relationship to truth does not depend upon whether anyone recognizes it. The person can be visible if necessary, hidden if appropriate. Neither state determines value. This leads to another remarkable reversal. At first, the practitioner may need to transgress the expectation of holiness. Later, they may need to transgress the expectation of transgression. The radical figure takes off the costume. No skull, no scandal, no esoteric persona, no deliberately shocking speech. No need to remind anyone that ordinary norms have been transcended. The person can simply exist, work, cook, teach, raise children, serve, sit quietly. The spiritual current has not disappeared. Its need for visible confirmation has. At the mature edge, transgression may cease to look transgressive at all. This is not regression into conformity. It is freedom from the necessity of appearing outside it. The mature fruit should also not be confused with flattening. A corpse and a living body are not the same. Sex and celibacy are not the same. A loving relationship and an abusive relationship are not the same. A glass of water and a glass of poison are not the same. The person who has dissolved contraction does not become incapable of judgment. They become more capable of judgment because judgment no longer has to defend identity. This produces a subtle but crucial transformation. Difference remains. Otherness loses metaphysical pollution. A person can say, this is wrong for me without needing. This is inherently impure. They can say, this person is dangerous without. This person is less human. They can say, this act causes harm without. This act falls outside reality. They can say, I refuse without hatred. This is what discrimination without contraction actually means. Transmutation and pure perception. Not every transgressive tradition understands transformation primarily as the disappearance of exclusion. Some go further. Certain forms of Vajrayana begin from the recognition that the forces which bind consciousness cannot always be divided neatly into spiritual and non-spiritual material. Desire binds, anger binds, fear binds, intense bodily experience binds. Yet the energy moving through these states is not necessarily identical with the ignorance through which it ordinarily functions. This produces one of the boldest intuitions of tantric spirituality. What ordinarily participates in bondage may, under radically altered conditions of awareness, become material of liberation. This is not the same as saying that bondage is already liberation. The distinction is decisive. Ordinary craving does not become wisdom because a practitioner calls it tantric. Anger does not become awakened wrath merely because it is intense. Sexual desire does not become non-dual bliss simply because it occurs inside a ritual setting. The mode of cognition must change. The same human energy that ordinarily moves through grasping, aversion, possession, or self-confirmation is taken into a different contemplative field and deprived of its habitual organization. This gives Vajrayana a somewhat different emphasis from the Kaula dissolution of Shanka. Kaula asks, what has consciousness excluded from Bhairava? Tantric Buddhism may also ask, can the very force through which samsara ordinarily operates cease to function in its ordinary way? The first operation dissolves exclusion. The second transforms function. Both belong deeply to the transgressive-transformative mode. The mature practitioner, therefore, does not need to divide experience into spiritual energies that should be cultivated and unspiritual energies that must disappear before realization is possible. Everything can become material, but becoming material for practice is not the same as being granted obedience. A poison may be transformed into medicine only through an actual process of transformation. The existence of a path that can transform poison does not make poison medicine before the transformation occurs. This distinction protects the mode from one of its most seductive errors. Another mature fruit appears particularly clearly in Vajrayana. Transgressive practice may initially require an exceptional field, a mandala, a deity, a feast, a forbidden substance transformed sacramentally. The practitioner's ordinary world is interrupted. What appeared polluted is encountered as pure. What appeared ordinary is encountered as divine form. What appeared to be an ordinary body becomes deity body. The ritual deliberately reorganizes perception. But if this transformation matures, the exceptional field should gradually cease to remain exceptional. The point cannot be that reality becomes sacred only inside the mandala. That would merely create a new division: outside, ordinary; inside, pure. The deeper movement is toward a consciousness for which awakened perception no longer depends upon extraordinary ritual circumstances. The mandala begins to overflow its boundary. This gives another expression of the mature fruit. The transgressive support has completed its work when the world no longer needs the support in order to become includable. A skull cup can reveal something. Eventually, an ordinary cup must also be enough. A forbidden feast may destabilize purity. Eventually, ordinary food must cease to inhabit a lower metaphysical world. A powerful sexual practice may transform perception. Eventually, an ordinary human body must no longer require ritual intensity in order to appear within the sacred. In this sense, the mature fruit of transgression is not permanent access to extraordinary experience. It is an expanded capacity for the ordinary. The mandala becomes mature when it no longer needs to remain surrounded by ritual walls, and this leads directly toward reversible freedom. The practitioner does not remain dependent upon transformed perception as another altered state. They become increasingly capable of meeting what appears without dividing existence into what can and cannot participate in awakening. Power without dependence. Transgressive traditions often speak about the release of power. This makes sense. If enormous psychic energy was previously consumed by repression, avoidance, fear, shame, self-monitoring, purity, anxiety, or maintenance of social identity, then its dissolution can feel like liberation of energy. The person becomes less divided against themselves, more available, more spontaneous, more capable of entering situations previously impossible, but the released power can itself become another temptation. The practitioner may enjoy fearlessness, sexual magnetism, social unconventionality, charisma, capacity to shock, freedom from shame. Then these fruits become identity. The mode must therefore eventually relinquish even its own power. The mature question is not, how much can I transgress? It is, how little of my consciousness still needs to be organized around either prohibition or violation. That is far quieter and far deeper. From boundary crossing to non-dependence. The transgressive-transformative path may begin with a dramatic act. But if the process succeeds, the drama should gradually decrease. The forbidden becomes less magnetic. The pure becomes less fragile. The practitioner becomes less invested in either pole. The boundary may still exist conventionally, but it no longer determines identity. The person can encounter what was once excluded without losing clarity. They can refuse what was once seductive without hatred. They can accept what was once shameful without needing to celebrate it. They can leave what was once sacred without contempt. They can return to what was once conventional without defeat. This is the mature fruit. The boundary no longer decides who the person must be, and this is why the endpoint of the mode cannot be called permanent transgression. Permanent transgression would still be permanent relation to the boundary. The endpoint is freedom in relation to both sides. The person no longer needs to prove, I am inside, nor I am outside. They can simply respond, approach, refrain, enter, leave, speak, remain silent. The action follows reality rather than the need to maintain identity. The transgressive mode begins with the intuition that what consciousness excludes can govern it. It matures when the practitioner discovers something stronger. Nothing needs to be excluded in order for discernment to remain, and nothing needs to be enacted in order for inclusion to become real. What remains is neither purity nor impurity, neither conformity nor rebellion, neither suppression nor indulgence. It is the increasingly quiet freedom to encounter what arises without being commanded by either attraction or recoil. Distortion and self-sealing. The transgressive-transformative mode has unusual power because it works close to psychic voltage. It approaches what fear, disgust, shame, desire, identity, or sacred prohibition have made difficult to touch. That same power gives it unusual capacity for distortion. The mode can expose hypocrisy. It can dismantle inherited fear. It can release energy trapped in repression. It can dissolve social and spiritual boundaries that have become metaphysically absolute. But it can also give extraordinary language to appetite, grandiosity, domination, instability, and self-deception. This is why the mature form of the mode cannot be judged by extremity. A practitioner may cross more boundaries than almost anyone around them and still remain deeply bound. Indeed, some of the strongest distortions of this mode arise precisely when the practitioner takes the ability to cross boundaries as evidence that they have already gone beyond the ordinary mechanisms of ego. The mistake is subtle. I can do what others cannot do. Therefore, I must be freer than they are. Sometimes this is true in a narrow sense. It may demonstrate freedom from one particular inhibition, but freedom from one inhibition is not freedom as such. A person may become fearless before sexual taboo, while remaining terrified of insignificance. They may become indifferent to ritual purity, while remaining dependent upon admiration. They may become comfortable with death, while remaining unable to apologize. They may endure social disgrace, while becoming addicted to the identity of being misunderstood. They may violate every outer convention while remaining psychologically governed by the need to be exceptional. This leads to one of the most important principles of the mode. Transgression can dissolve one structure of bondage while leaving others almost untouched. A successful transgressive operation proves what it proves. No more. When appetite receives sacred language. The simplest distortion occurs when spiritual transgression confirms something the practitioner already wanted. The person desires sexual novelty, then discovers a teaching in which sexual novelty can be described as liberation. The person enjoys intoxication, then encounters a ritual tradition in which intoxicants have sacred significance. The person dislikes social responsibility, then discovers a spirituality of radical spontaneity. The person enjoys shocking others, then finds a language of sacred foolishness. The outer form becomes more religious. The inner necessity may remain unchanged. Nothing has actually been relinquished. Nothing difficult has been confronted. The practitioner has merely found a metaphysics hospitable to existing appetite. This is why a transgressive act cannot be authenticated by its traditional pedigree alone. A practice may be ancient, the mantra correct, the initiation legitimate, the ritual performed exactly, and yet for this practitioner, in this moment, the act may function primarily as gratification. The traditional form does not determine the psychological operation. If the practice leaves existing compulsions intact and merely gives them sacred language, it has not become transformative transgression. This does not mean that authentic practice must always be unpleasant. That would simply recreate asceticism as universal criterion. Pleasure may arise. Joy may arise, erotic intensity may arise, but pleasure cannot authenticate the act, nor can the fact that pleasure occurred invalidate it. The question remains, what became freer? transgressive identity, escalation, and charismatic capital. A more sophisticated distortion occurs when transgression itself becomes the basis of identity. The practitioner is no longer merely someone who has crossed certain boundaries. They become the fearless one, the Vara, the wild yogin, the one beyond convention, the crazy wisdom teacher, the avadhuta, the sacred fool, the tantric who cannot be judged by ordinary people. At first, such identities may point towards something real. A practitioner may indeed have developed unusual capacities, but identity has a remarkable ability to appropriate whatever once threatened it. Even ego-dissolving practices can become raw material for ego. The practice designed to destroy identity can create one of the most intoxicating identities available. The transgressive identity is particularly powerful because it contains built-in superiority. Ordinary people remain afraid, conditioned, moralistic, repressed, bourgeois, pashu, unable to understand. The practitioner stands outside. This can make radicality itself feel like evidence of depth. The more forbidden the act, the more advanced the practitioner appears, the more scandal generated, the greater the assumed freedom. But radicality is not depth. The severity of the prohibition crossed tells us little about the maturity of the whole person. One person may cross an extraordinary taboo through courage and clarity, another through impulsivity, another through social pressure, another through narcissistic entitlement, another because the taboo never carried much force for them in the first place. The external act cannot adjudicate between these possibilities. There is an irony hidden inside transgressive identity. The person who defines themselves as one who crosses boundaries begins to need boundaries. Without prohibition, there is no transgression. Without conventional people, there is nobody to be more liberated than. Without scandal, there is no proof of radicality. Thus, the practitioner can become dependent upon the very structures they claim to have transcended. The orthodox person needs the rule. The transgressor needs someone to impose the rule so that it can be violated. Both remain organized around it. This can generate an endless search for new thresholds. Yesterday's forbidden object becomes ordinary, so something stronger is required, a more dangerous ritual, a more shocking sexual configuration, a more offensive statement, a more radical social rupture. The practitioner begins to escalate. The original purpose was to reduce charge, but now increasing charge is necessary to preserve identity. Transgression has become stimulation. At this point, the path begins to resemble addiction, not necessarily addiction to a substance, addiction to intensity, to danger, to scandal, to the subjective feeling of being beyond limits. The practitioner cannot become ordinary because ordinariness would feel like spiritual death. This is one of the clearest signs that the boundary has not actually lost sovereignty. Modern media intensifies this distortion. Outrage circulates. Extreme claims attract attention. A teacher who says, "I live quietly and practice carefully," is less visible than one who declares themselves beyond morality, beyond institutions, beyond ordinary sexuality, beyond conventional consciousness. Transgression becomes a brand. The teacher's unusual life becomes evidence of unusual realization. Every scandal increases fascination. Every critic confirms the persona. Of course, ordinary minds cannot understand. The forbidden becomes marketable. Transgression becomes charismatic capital. This is particularly dangerous because the teacher may simultaneously criticize spiritual materialism while benefiting from the prestige of appearing radically outside it. The anti brand becomes a brand. The anti guru becomes a guru. The rejection of convention becomes a recognizable performance. The mode must therefore learn to ask, would this transgression still matter if nobody knew it happened? If not, perhaps the audience is the real object. The charismatic teacher and asymmetrical freedom. In modern spiritual culture, this distortion frequently becomes embodied in a recognizable persona. The transgressive teacher appears fearless, sexually confident, rhetorically powerful, unembarrassed by taboo, dismissive of conventional morality, comfortable with contradiction, perhaps visionary, perhaps genuinely learned, perhaps capable of producing powerful experiences in others. Such a person can be extraordinarily attractive, especially to disciples whose own lives have been organized by shame, inhibition, family control, religious guilt, social conformity, sexual fear, or a sense that ordinary life is suffocating. The teacher seems to embody a possibility. Here is someone who is free where I am not. That perception can be accurate. A teacher may indeed embody capacities the disciple has not developed, but this very perception creates enormous asymmetry. The teacher becomes more than a person. They become the disciple's image of freedom. Then, several kinds of authority converge. The teacher knows the doctrine. The teacher interprets the disciple's inner life. The teacher controls access to initiation or community. The teacher may become erotically charged. The teacher's unconventionality itself becomes evidence of realization. The result can be one of the most powerful authority structures found anywhere in spiritual culture, and paradoxically, it often speaks the language of equality. This produces a characteristic inversion. The teacher may be free to change rules, break rules, reinterpret agreements, enter relationships, leave relationships, speak harshly, act unpredictably, reject conventional obligations. But the disciple is expected to trust, surrender, remain non reactive, overcome jealousy, question their conditioning, accept discomfort, interpret uncertainty as practice. Thus, the teacher is free to reinterpret every rule. The disciple is not free to reinterpret the teacher. The rhetoric may say there is no hierarchy in ultimate reality. The lived structure may be intensely hierarchical. The teacher receives spontaneity. The disciple receives obedience. The teacher's impulses receive metaphysical interpretation. The disciple's resistance receives psychological interpretation. This is one of the most dangerous asymmetries of the mode. I am free becomes the teacher's privilege. You must let go becomes the disciple's obligation. At that point, non duality has not dissolved hierarchy, it has sacralized it. The danger becomes especially acute when spiritual and erotic authority converge. Sexuality is already a field of enormous psychological intensity. Add guru status, initiation, doctrinal authority, community prestige, claims of special spiritual perception, and the possibility that sexual contact itself is described as transmission. Now, an ordinary interpersonal situation becomes extremely difficult to interpret. The disciple may genuinely desire the teacher. The teacher may genuinely desire the disciple. No manipulation need be consciously planned, but the context changes what desire means. The disciple may experience attraction as destiny, shaktipata, tantric qualification, recognition by the guru, an opportunity to transcend conditioning. Refusal can begin to feel spiritually dangerous. One no longer simply says, I don't want this. Instead, am I refusing my own liberation? This is why consent cannot be reduced to the fact that two adults verbally agreed. The deeper question is, could the disciple meaningfully refuse without believing that refusal demonstrated spiritual inferiority? If the surrounding doctrine has already interpreted fear, jealousy, discomfort, hesitation, or refusal as evidence of conditioning, the field has become epistemically distorted. This gives one of the strongest ethical principles of the mode. Consent becomes spiritually compromised when refusal has been interpreted in advance as evidence of bondage, and therefore, transgressive spirituality may relativize purity codes. It does not thereby relativize consent. A boundary may be socially constructed. Another person's boundary remains theirs. The fact that a teacher believes it would be spiritually beneficial to cross it does not transfer ownership. A still subtler danger appears when the teacher sincerely believes their own metaphysical interpretation. It is tempting to imagine spiritual abuse only in terms of conscious deception. The teacher knows they want sex, power, money, admiration, and deliberately invents doctrine to get it. That certainly occurs, but there is another possibility that may be more difficult to correct. The teacher has had real visionary experiences, real altered states, real spiritual insight, real capacity to affect disciples, real knowledge. They have repeatedly experienced spontaneous action, emerging from states they regard as non dual. Then ordinary desire arises. But the teacher no longer has a clear category for ordinary desire arising in me. Instead, Shakti is moving. The goddess wants this. This is spontaneous activity. This is transmission. At that point, self deception can become almost total. There may be no deliberate lie. the interpretive framework itself protects appetite from ordinary recognition. The more extraordinary a person's spiritual experiences, the more important it becomes that ordinary human motives remain conceptually available. Otherwise, every impulse becomes elevated before it can be examined. This is one reason realization requires discrimination rather than eliminating it. A visionary can still be lonely, a guru can still be sexually attracted, a realized person can still become angry, a charismatic teacher can still enjoy admiration. None of these possibilities diminish genuine spiritual experience, but denying their possibility makes self-correction nearly impossible. Metaphysical immunity, crazy wisdom, pure perception, and the divine self. The Buddhist language of crazy wisdom provides one of the clearest examples of this danger. At its best, unconventional activity can serve a genuine pedagogical function. A teacher disrupts a student's rigid expectation. A mad yogin refuses respectable spiritual identity. A shocking act exposes attachment to appearances. A saint behaves in ways that prevent admiration from becoming possession. But a dangerous reversal can occur. The original proposition is realized activity may sometimes look unconventional. The distorted conclusion becomes, therefore, unconventional activity is evidence of realization. Once that reversal occurs, ordinary signs of dysfunction can be reinterpreted upward. Rage becomes wrathful compassion. Alcohol abuse becomes divine intoxication, sexual compulsivity becomes tantric freedom, humiliation becomes ego destruction, instability becomes spontaneity, grandiosity becomes Buddha pride, cruelty becomes fierce blessing. This creates an extraordinarily powerful semantic shield. The transgressive mode is uniquely capable of converting pathology into charisma because the very behaviors that would normally invite scrutiny can be redescribed as evidence of realization. The more outrageous the act, the deeper the disciple may assume the teaching to be. Criticism itself becomes proof that the critic is trapped in convention. The system closes. Vajrayana contributes another particularly subtle danger. The doctrine of pure perception begins from a profound insight. Ordinary perception is conditioned. What appears self-evidently impure, degraded, threatening, or spiritually meaningless may reveal as much about the perceiving consciousness as about the object perceived. The practitioner therefore learns not to absolutize immediate appearance, but this becomes dangerous when transferred from contemplative practice into unquestionable interpersonal authority. The movement can become, my perception is conditioned, then my negative perception of the teacher must therefore be impure. Then finally, the teacher's interpretation of what happened is spiritually more valid than my own experience of it. At that point, a practice intended to loosen fixation begins suppressing evidence. Cruelty is renamed wrathful compassion. Coercion becomes transmission. Humiliation becomes blessing. Confusion becomes proof that the teaching is operating beyond conceptual mind. The disciple is trained to distrust precisely the perceptions through which harm might otherwise become recognizable. Pure perception cannot mean compulsory misperception. To know that appearances are conditioned does not require pretending that consequences are unreal. A practitioner may hold the possibility that their interpretation is incomplete while still saying, "This harmed me. I do not consent. This behavior is dangerous. I think my teacher was wrong." Otherwise, pure perception becomes another self-sealing technology. The deeper tantric transformation must increase the range of reality that consciousness can encounter. It cannot require reality to be renamed whenever it contradicts the spiritual image of the teacher. And the same principle applies internally. The fact that anger can theoretically be transformed into wisdom does not mean that every angry outburst is wisdom. The fact that desire can enter the path does not mean that every desire has entered the path. Transformation cannot be inferred merely from the presence of the material supposedly being transformed. The fruit must show that a transformation actually occurred. Every mode can become self-sealing. The transgressive mode has a particularly effective mechanism. Suppose someone tells the teacher, "Your behavior harmed me." The teacher replies, "Your pain is attachment." Another says, "I think you are wrong. Your judgment is dualistic." Another leaves. They lacked qualification. Another raises ethical concerns. They are trapped in conventional morality. Another points out narcissism. They cannot tolerate a powerful teacher. Every possible datum has already been interpreted in a way that confirms the teacher's realization. Nothing can falsify the claim. At that point, the system has become epistemically invulnerable. This is one of the most severe failures possible in spiritual life. A person may become fearless before taboo while remaining terrified of correction. That sentence reaches deeper than any discussion of ritual extremity. A person may enter cremation grounds without fear, perform dangerous rites, break sexual prohibitions, reject social judgment, and still be unable to tolerate. You may be wrong. Then the deepest boundary has simply moved. The ego no longer protects purity, it protects realization. Non-dual realization contains a profound claim. The deepest identity is not the limited ego, but that claim can be appropriated by the ego with extraordinary ease. The movement becomes, I am not merely this personality. Then, I am Shiva. Then, my actions arise from Shiva. Then, ordinary judgment cannot apply to my actions. The progression is not logically necessary, but psychologically it is seductive. The individual self gains metaphysical infinity without necessarily surrendering its ordinary defensive structure. Now, criticism of the person can be interpreted as failure to recognize divinity. Obedience can become devotion to Shiva. Sexual access becomes access to Shakti. The teacher's preferences acquire cosmic scale. This is no longer non-duality dissolving narcissism. It is narcissism receiving non-dual ontology. The corrective must therefore be uncompromising. The recognition that all experience arises within reality does not make one's personal interpretation of experience infallible. And no metaphysical realization removes reality's right to contradict the person who realized it. This returns to the central criterion running through all the modes. Can reality still correct the person? If not, the mode has become self-sealing. Righteous dice and deity nanapredot pratzais. Freedom in one domain, responsibility in the whole person. This deserves particular emphasis because transgression produces dramatic evidence of achievement. A person may genuinely have overcome a powerful boundary. That achievement should not be denied, but it can be overgeneralized. A practitioner becomes free of sexual shame, then assumes themselves broadly liberated. A yogin loses fear of death, then assumes ordinary ethics no longer apply. A teacher becomes indifferent to social reputation, then assumes criticism cannot reveal anything important. A practitioner destroys caste disgust, then remains domineering in intimate relationships. Different structures of conditioning are partially independent. Therefore, freedom in one charged domain is not freedom as such. This is true of every mode. The great analyst may remain emotionally immature. The visionary may remain epistemically naive. The ascetic may remain rigid. The devotee may remain dependent. The transgressor may remain narcissistic. No operation contains the whole person. This is precisely why the transgressive mode must not become the hidden summit of the taxonomy. Its power can be extraordinary. Its reach remains particular. Another shadow becomes visible when we stop asking only, did the practitioner feel freer? And ask, who paid for that freedom? Transgressive acts occur within causal worlds. Sex may produce pregnancy. Relationship experimentation may produce attachment, jealousy, family disruption, financial consequences, or responsibilities toward children. Drug use affects families and communities. A guru's unpredictable behavior affects disciples. A person's rejection of social structure may leave dependents carrying obligations they abandoned. The practitioner's subjective liberation does not erase these consequences. This is particularly important because transgressive rhetoric often focuses on the person whose boundary is being crossed, their conditioning, their liberation, their authenticity, their freedom. But other people are not merely symbolic components of one's sadhana. They have their own bodies, needs, histories, attachments, boundaries, children, material limitations. The mature criterion must therefore include a transgressive act must be judged not only by the boundary it crosses, but by the responsibilities it creates afterward. And freedom that externalizes its consequences onto another person is not yet freedom. A person who wants freedom of action, but resists responsibility for consequence, has not transcended convention. They have simply separated liberty from accountability. A related distortion occurs when one particular transgressive form is universalized into a model of enlightened society. Sexual openness becomes spiritually superior to monogamy. Polyamory becomes more evolved than pair bonding. Marriage becomes inherently possessive, institutional life becomes spiritually inferior to nomadism, traditional ritual becomes repression, unconventional dress becomes authenticity, radical transparency becomes superior to privacy. Any of these forms may suit particular people. None is automatically evidence of awakening. The problem begins when a contingent experiment becomes metaphysics. Then anyone who prefers another form must be explained away. Monogamy becomes jealousy, privacy becomes shame, structure becomes fear, commitment becomes possession, refusal becomes conditioning. Again, the interpretive system becomes self-sealing. A transgressive practice becomes ideology when one possible form of freedom is turned into the required appearance of freedom. The mature mode must resist this. No relationship structure is inherently enlightened. No social arrangement guarantees non-possession. A monogamous relationship can be controlling. It can also be extraordinarily free. A polyamorous arrangement can embody honesty and responsibility. It can also become avoidance, novelty seeking, or asymmetric privilege. Outer structure does not decide, the operation does. When the wrong boundary is attacked, another severe distortion occurs when every charged boundary is treated as something to confront. A practitioner feels terror. The teacher says, "Good, go deeper." The person dissociates. Your ego is resisting. The nervous system becomes overwhelmed. The practice is breaking you open. This is dangerous. A trauma response is not automatically evidence that a liberating boundary has been found. Sometimes the person needs safety, distance, stabilization, time, therapeutic support, or simply the right to refuse. Aggressive transgression can re-traumatize rather than integrate. The mere fact that a practice produces intense reaction says nothing about whether the reaction is transformative. Overwhelm is not transcendence. This again explains the traditional emphasis on fitness. High voltage practices require a nervous system capable of remaining present. Without sufficient containment, exposure does not dissolve contraction, it may reinforce it. A related distortion can occur even without a guru. The practitioner internalizes the belief that every excluded possibility must eventually be confronted, every sexual taboo explored, every fear overcome, every shadow integrated, every identity dismantled, every boundary crossed. The spiritual life becomes a campaign against incompleteness. There is always another forbidden room, another wound, another polarity, another hidden desire, another unintegrated possibility. But this is merely totalization in transgressive form. The person becomes unable to leave anything alone. Not everything excluded needs enactment. Not every unopened door represents bondage. Sometimes no is complete. Sometimes distance is wisdom. Sometimes the practitioner understands a possibility fully and still has no reason to approach it further. Sometimes the deepest freedom is to realize, I do not need to know. The mature transgressor does not conquer every possible threshold. They become less governed by the need to conquer thresholds at all. One of the clearest signs of incomplete transgression is inability to return to ordinary form. A practitioner becomes radically anti-monogamous and can no longer imagine fidelity without seeing bondage, rejects institutions, and cannot enter one without feeling contaminated, breaks ritual convention and begins despising those who still observe it, becomes sexually uninhibited and interprets restraint as repression, develops sacred fool identity and cannot speak plainly, learns to live outside social norms, and comes to depend upon outsider status. In each case, the original boundary has been crossed, but its opposite has become forbidden. The person remains polarized. If convention itself has become intolerable, convention still governs consciousness negatively. This is why the capacity to return matters. The mature practitioner can re-enter ordinary form without experiencing defeat. They can conform where appropriate, without surrendering inner freedom. If not, rebellion remains unfinished. The final self-sealing. Eventually the mode can reach its most dangerous distortion. Transgression itself becomes sacred. To question a radical practice is treated as proof of repression. To question a teacher is treated as conventional morality. To ask about harm is treated as dualism. To ask whether a taboo remains relevant is treated as cowardice. The tradition that once existed to interrogate absolute boundaries creates a new absolute boundary around itself. Transgression must not be questioned. At that moment, the mode has betrayed its own deepest principle. The path designed to expose what consciousness cannot approach has produced something it cannot allow to be approached critically. This is why the final criterion must always remain outside the mode. Can reality still correct it? Can the practitioner discover that a practice once useful is no longer useful? Can they admit that a teacher acted badly? Can a tradition acknowledge that a historical rite has lost its function? Can a visionary discover that their interpretation was wrong? Can the transgressor hear, "You are harming people," without immediately translating the statement into someone else's conditioning? If not, no amount of boundary crossing can rescue the structure. The deepest failure of this mode can therefore be stated very simply. A person may become capable of approaching almost everything except evidence against themselves. They can face death, sex, disgrace, impurity, social rejection, religious prohibition, fear, but cannot face, "I was wrong." Then the mode has reached its limit. The final forbidden object is correction, and until that object can be approached, the person remains bound. This gives perhaps the deepest shadow formulation of the transgressive-transformative mode. The person who is willing to cross every boundary except the boundary around their own self-image has not yet reached the heart of transgression, because ultimately the mode is not about taboo. It is about what consciousness cannot bear to let inside, and sometimes what it cannot bear is not sex, death, impurity, madness, or disgrace. Sometimes it is reality itself. Testing it in life. The transgressive-transformative mode cannot be tested by how dramatic a practice looks. That is precisely what makes it difficult. The most shocking act may be spiritually trivial. The quietest encounter may reach the deepest knot. A practitioner may enter a cremation ground and remain psychologically unchanged. Another may sit beside a dying parent, unable to escape the reality of death, and undergo a more radical confrontation with impermanence than any ritualized encounter could provide. Someone may perform a forbidden sexual rite with elaborate initiatory precision while remaining governed by appetite, vanity, or fear of intimacy. Another may simply acknowledge a desire they have spent 20 years refusing to admit, neither acting upon it nor condemning it, and something essential may finally relax. The visible action therefore tells us very little. The question is always, what structure of bondage was present before, and what is different now? This chapter is not a manual for transgression. There can be no universal inventory of practices, because the mode is radically dependent upon person, context, development, and the kind of boundary involved. What can be tested are the operations surrounding the boundary. Certain questions repeatedly reveal whether the movement is toward freedom or merely toward another form of compulsion. Name the boundary and its function. The next question is even more important. What function is this boundary serving? A protective boundary should not be treated like a caste taboo. A developmental discipline should not be treated like eternal metaphysics. A socially inherited prejudice should not be granted the authority of bodily danger. An identity boundary should not be mistaken for moral truth, merely because violating it produces anxiety. The categories introduced earlier become practical here. Is it protective? Does this boundary prevent actual harm? Does it preserve bodily safety, consent, psychological stability, distance from someone abusive? If yes, crossing it may not be spiritually mature at all. Like, is it developmental? Was the boundary established because a capacity is still being trained? A recovering addict's avoidance of alcohol is not necessarily fear requiring transgression. A novice's discipline may still be doing essential work. Prematurely abolishing such boundaries can destroy the very freedom they were intended to cultivate. Is it conventional? Does the boundary primarily preserve inherited ideas of respectability, purity, status, caste, gender propriety, religious appearance? Then the transgressive operation may become much more relevant. Is it protecting identity? This is often the hardest category to see. If the boundary disappeared, would anything actually become dangerous? Or would the person simply have to relinquish an image of themselves? That question can expose a great deal. Can I approach? Can I refrain? This may be the first great test. Before asking, can I cross the boundary? Ask, can I choose not to? If not, the practice may already be compromised. The person who cannot resist sexual opportunity does not demonstrate freedom through sexual transgression. The person who needs intoxicants does not prove non-duality by using them ritually. The person who continually seeks conflict cannot authenticate wrathful activity through another confrontation. The person addicted to being unconventional cannot establish liberation by breaking another social rule. This is where ascetic discipline becomes the hidden foundation of mature transgression. The capacity to refrain protects the experiment from being swallowed by appetite. A useful diagnostic therefore becomes, if the supposedly sacred justification disappeared tomorrow, would I still feel compelled toward the act? If yes, that does not automatically invalidate the practice, but it tells us something important about the forces already present. The inverse test is equally important. A person may be very capable of abstention, perhaps too capable. They can control desire, avoid danger, maintain discipline, keep the forbidden object at a safe conceptual distance. But can they approach without collapse? Can they listen to an opposing view without immediately defending identity? Can they sit beside someone who activates disgust? Can they acknowledge sexual desire without immediately suppressing it? Can they encounter someone who broke a sacred rule without needing to dehumanize them? Can they read criticism of their tradition without feeling that the sacred itself is threatened? If not, the restraint may conceal fear. Thus, the two questions belong together. Can I approach? Can I abstain? This pair may be the simplest practical expression of the relationship between modes 8 and 9. If only approach is possible, there may be compulsion. If only abstention is possible, there may be contraction. Freedom increases when both become available. Does the charge actually decrease? One of the clearest signs of genuine transformation is reduction of charge. After practice, does the forbidden object become less obsessive, less frightening, less glamorous, less central to identity? Can the practitioner think about something else? Can they live without repeating the practice? If the answer is yes, something may genuinely have integrated. But if the practitioner increasingly needs the object, something else may be happening. The sexual rite becomes central to spiritual identity. The taboo substance must be repeated. The practitioner seeks stronger transgression. The guru's outrageous behavior becomes endlessly fascinating. The person spends increasing amounts of time talking about how conventional everyone else is. Then the boundary may have gained, rather than lost, power. A useful principle is, successful transgression tends to reduce the symbolic inflation of its object. What was forbidden eventually becomes ordinary enough to be chosen or refused without drama. Responsibility, cost, and the other person's no. This test is especially important because transgressive rhetoric can easily romanticize liberation while ignoring consequence. After the boundary is crossed, is the practitioner more capable of carrying what follows, or less? Does sexual freedom produce greater honesty, greater care, greater clarity around attachment and consequence, or merely more opportunity? Does freedom from social approval make the practitioner more truthful, or simply less responsive to feedback? Does freedom from institutional convention increase responsibility, or provide justification for unreliability? Does the practitioner become more capable of acknowledging harm, or more capable of explaining why harm does not count? The mature fruit should increase the person's ability to inhabit consequence. Freedom that cannot remain present for its consequences is incomplete freedom. This is especially important where others are involved. The practitioner's internal transformation does not make another person's suffering irrelevant. Ask concretely, who pays if this experiment goes badly? Only the practitioner, a partner, a disciple, children, family, a community, someone financially dependent on them, someone with less power? This question can strip spiritual glamour very quickly. A guru may frame a sexual experiment as freedom, but if the disciple carries emotional devastation while the teacher moves on, the distribution of cost matters. A person may celebrate radical independence, but if others are left carrying their responsibilities, the spiritual vocabulary becomes suspect. Transgression can be mature only when it does not treat other people as expendable material for one person's realization. No one else's life exists merely as an instrument for my boundary crossing. That principle should be uncompromising. Where practice involves another person, this question is absolute. Not, did they technically consent, but could they refuse without losing status, belonging, spiritual legitimacy, affection, initiation, livelihood, or access to the teacher? Power alters the meaning of consent. This is particularly important in guru-disciple relationships. If the teacher defines the spiritual meaning of the disciple's refusal, the situation is already asymmetrical. A disciple who says no must not then be told, "Your fear proves the necessity of the practice. Your jealousy reveals attachment. Your refusal shows lack of surrender. Your hesitation means you are unqualified." Such interpretations make the teacher the final authority over both sides of the interaction. At that point, the disciple's boundary ceases to be truly theirs. A mature transgressive tradition should do the opposite. It should make the capacity to say no stronger, because a person who cannot refuse cannot meaningfully transgress either. Corrigibility and the difference between harm and conditioning. This is perhaps the most important question of all. After years of transgressive practice, can the person hear criticism more easily, admit mistakes, revise interpretation, recognize that a powerful experience may have been misunderstood, accept that a teacher behaved badly, acknowledge that a ritual may no longer be appropriate, allow another person to describe harm without immediately spiritualizing it? If not, something has gone wrong. The entire transgressive mode exists to expose places consciousness cannot approach. Therefore, criticism itself becomes one of its ultimate tests. Can I approach evidence that threatens my image of myself? For a teacher, this may be more difficult than entering a cremation ground. For a scholar, more difficult than studying forbidden doctrines. For a spiritual practitioner, more difficult than sexual or ritual transgression. Because here the forbidden object is, I may have been wrong. This is the boundary around which entire spiritual systems can harden. Thus the master criterion returns. Can reality still correct me? If the answer is no, the mode has become self-sealing. This is another essential test. Transgressive traditions often reveal that discomfort can arise from inherited conditioning. True. But discomfort can also arise because something is genuinely harmful. The practitioner must retain the capacity to distinguish. This frightens me because my identity is being challenged from. This frightens me because I am unsafe. And this disgust is inherited prejudice from. This revulsion is telling me I do not consent. And this rule is conventional from. This rule protects people. The mature practitioner does not automatically trust every aversion, but neither do they automatically distrust it. They investigate. This is more demanding than ideology. Ideology already knows what every reaction means. Mature discernment does not. Is my range expanding? A practice can produce apparent freedom by eliminating situations in which bondage becomes visible. The practitioner says, I no longer care what anyone thinks, but they have removed everyone who disagrees. I am free from jealousy, but partners are forbidden to express needs that activate it. I am beyond institutions, but the person now avoids all settings requiring accountability. I am beyond ordinary morality, but the community has become socially isolated enough that outside judgment never enters. This is not necessarily freedom. Sometimes the world has simply been arranged around the practitioner's defenses. A useful test is, has my range of possible relationship with reality expanded? Can more life be encountered? More kinds of people? More disagreement? More uncertainty? More responsibility? Or has the practice produced an increasingly narrow environment in which the practitioner's preferred interpretation is protected? Maturity should increase range, not necessarily activity. Range. This is a surprisingly mature test. Can the practitioner acknowledge, I could explore this, but I do not need to? Not because of fear, not because of moral panic, simply because there is no compelling reason. A person may understand a boundary thoroughly enough to know that nothing important remains behind it. Then the need to cross becomes its own compulsion. Spiritual maturity includes the capacity to leave possibilities unrealized. Freedom does not require exhausting possibility. This matters especially in a culture that often equates liberation with maximal experience. More sexuality, more travel, more substances, more altered states, more identities, more experiments. But unlimited possibility can become another tyranny. A life has finite time. Every yes excludes another possibility. Mature transgression does not demand that the practitioner consume the entire field of human experience in order to prove that nothing has been forbidden. Sometimes I could, but I won't is complete. The ordinary test. Ultimately, the best test may be mundane. What is the person like afterward? Not during ritual, not while teaching, not while surrounded by disciples, not while discussing non-duality. But when tired, when contradicted, when rejected, when nobody is impressed, when a child needs attention, when work is boring, when another person has needs that interfere with desire, when money is tight, when plans fail, when illness arrives, when apology is required, does the freedom remain? This is where dramatic states encounter ordinary reality. A person may appear extraordinarily liberated inside the ceremonial field and become controlling when dinner does not happen on time. That discrepancy matters. No transgressive achievement should be exempt from the test of ordinary life. The mode's mature fruit should eventually become visible precisely there, not necessarily as saintliness, but as increased room, less compulsion, less recoil, less need to dominate, more capacity to choose, more ability to admit contradiction, more responsibility. Much of this chapter can finally be condensed into two questions. Before the boundary, can I approach without losing myself? After the boundary, can I refuse without needing to defend myself? Approach without collapse, refusal without contraction. Between them lies much of the mature freedom of the mode, and around both remains the question that no spiritual practice can be allowed to escape. Can reality still correct me? If yes, even a dangerous path may remain alive. If no, even the most radical transgression has hardened into another wall. Traditions, exemplars, and configurations. The transgressive-transformative mode is not the property of Tantra, nor is Tantra itself one thing. Across traditions, very different spiritual worlds discovered that prohibition, disgust, fear, social identity, passion, reputation, and even the expected appearance of holiness could become materials of transformation. Their metaphysics should not be collapsed. Kola recognition is not Buddhist emptiness. Agora is not Christian holy foolishness. Malamati concealment is not Avaduta spontaneity. Their aims, doctrines, ritual technologies, and ethical vocabularies remain distinct. Yet a recognizable family resemblance appears. Again and again, consciousness approaches something that has acquired disproportionate power through exclusion. Sometimes the purpose is to dissolve the distinction between pure and impure, sometimes to transform the very energies that ordinarily produce bondage, sometimes to approach death, disgust, or social pollution, sometimes to destroy attachment to appearing holy, sometimes to relinquish the need for any publicly recognizable spiritual identity at all. The boundary changes, the transgressive operation changes with it. Kaula, where consciousness still says, not Bhairava. The non-dual Shaiva-Kaula traditions surrounding Abhinavagupta provide perhaps the most precise metaphysical articulation of the mode. Their radical practices cannot be understood simply as a celebration of forbidden things. The deeper issue is difference, where difference has become contraction. The practitioner may affirm philosophically, everything is Shiva, yet an object appears and consciousness hesitates, a substance, a bodily secretion, a sexual configuration, a person classified as impure. The abstract non-duality suddenly encounters an exception. Everything is Bhairava, but surely not this. This embodied hesitation is the field of Shanka. It is not merely intellectual uncertainty. Something draws back. The difference has acquired existential force. Related to this is Bedamala, the impurity of differentiation, not ordinary perceptual distinction, but the contraction through which difference becomes metaphysical separation. The transgressive support becomes useful precisely because it reaches that separation. The forbidden object is spiritually significant insofar as it reaches the place where consciousness still says, not Bhairava. This gives Kaula transgression its precision. The substance is secondary, the contraction is primary. Liquor is not metaphysically superior to water. A cremation ground substance does not contain more reality than a flower. Sex is not intrinsically more non-dual than celibacy. What matters is the distinction consciousness has invested with absolute force. Hence the importance of principles such as Yathalabam. The support cannot become an idol. The transgressive support is contingent. The contraction it exposes is primary, and Yatha Yogam introduces the complementary necessity of fitness. An intervention powerful enough to dissolve conditioning can also overwhelm, destabilize, or merely indulge an unprepared practitioner. The medicine works because of relationship between practitioner, boundary, method, and capacity, not because danger itself is holy. The kola sexual rite, the act is not the operation. This becomes particularly important with kola sexuality. Modern interpretations easily reduce the tradition to the assertion sexuality is sacred, but that is too weak to explain why such practices were surrounded by elaborate qualification, and why commentators distinguish the right from ordinary desire for pleasure. The same physical act can occur inside completely different structures of consciousness. Ordinary desire seeks gratification. The transgressive right, at least in its mature theory, uses an exceptionally charged field to interrupt habitual differentiation and intensify absorption into undivided consciousness. Thus, the right uses shock as solvent, not stimulant. This is why the sexual act cannot authenticate itself. The practitioner's excitement tells us almost nothing, nor does the traditional pedigree of the ritual. The relevant question remains, did the act dissolve contraction, or did it simply provide extraordinary circumstances for ordinary appetite? This distinction will recur with even greater force in Vajrayana. Vajrayana, transforming what binds into the path. Classical Buddhist Tantra belongs much more centrally to the transgressive transformative mode than the modern category of crazy wisdom alone would suggest. In the higher tantric traditions of medieval Indian Buddhism, particularly the Yogina Tantras, practitioners encounter many of the same deliberately charged materials known from the broader South Asian tantric environment: charnel grounds, meat, alcohol, sexual imagery and practice, wrathful forms, bone ornaments, ritual feasts, substances, and settings incompatible with ordinary purity. Historically, Buddhist and Shaiva tantric traditions developed in close proximity and sometimes drew from closely related ritual worlds. But the Buddhist philosophical emphasis introduces something distinctive. The transgressive question becomes not only can what was classified as impure be recognized without dualistic exclusion, it can also become can the very force that ordinarily binds consciousness be transformed into material of awakening? This is one of Vajrayana's most radical intuitions. Desire ordinarily participates in samsara. Anger does, fear does, intense pleasure can. The ordinary religious response may therefore be to weaken or eliminate these forces. Tantric Buddhism sometimes attempts another operation. Rather than discarding the energy completely, the practitioner enters a highly structured contemplative context in which its ordinary organization is transformed. The passion is not simply given permission, it is forced into another cognitive field. This is why the tantric principle that what binds can also participate in liberation must be handled carefully. It does not mean whatever binds me is secretly enlightenment. It means that the material of bondage may not have to be thrown away if the ignorance structuring it can actually be transformed. The transgressive mode does not always overcome a binding force by eliminating it. Sometimes it seeks to transform the cognition through which that very force operates. This is Vajrayana's distinctive contribution. The poison and the medicine. The metaphor of poison is particularly appropriate. Ordinary craving remains craving. Ordinary rage remains rage. Ordinary sexual compulsion remains compulsion. Tantric terminology does not alter their function. A poison becomes medicine only through a real transformation of relationship, dose, context, and use. Likewise, the existence of a tantric technology for transforming poison does not make every ingestion of poison medicine. This is why Vajrayana cannot coherently be reduced to antinomian permission. The tradition traditionally surrounds advanced tantric practice with empowerment, samaya, preliminary cultivation, bodhicitta, visualization, mantra, deity yoga, subtle body disciplines, and a complex teacher-disciple framework. Whatever one thinks of particular historical institutions, the structure itself expresses an important truth. Transgression is embedded in discipline. The practitioner is not supposed to begin with, I want this. Tantra says desire is sacred, therefore I am liberated through wanting it. The ordinary cognition is precisely what has to be transformed. Ganakakra, pollution becomes sacrament. The tantric feast provides one of the clearest ritual expressions of this operation. Materials excluded by conventional purity structures may enter the mandala: meat, alcohol, other ritually charged substances. What ordinary identity classifies as pollutant can be ritually transformed into sacrament. But again, the point is not merely reversal. Impure things are secretly better than pure things. That would leave the binary intact. The deeper ritual logic destabilizes the assumption that awakened reality can exist only on one side of the distinction. The feast becomes a concentrated field in which perception itself is reorganized. What was rejected appears as offering. What was polluting appears as amrta. What seemed ordinary or impure enters the mandala. This brings Vajrayana very close to Kaula, yet the Buddhist emphasis on transformed perception gives the operation another dimension: pure perception and the transformation of appearance. Vajrayana repeatedly asks the practitioner to stop taking ordinary perception as the final measure of what appears. The body can be contemplated as deity body, the environment as mandala, ordinary identity as deity. The ritual world is reconstructed as awakened appearance. This is not merely intellectual reinterpretation. At its mature edge, it attempts to alter the way experience itself is organized. The transgressive object, therefore, does not merely cease to be excluded, its entire phenomenological status may change. What consciousness previously encountered through pollution, grasping, ordinary embodiment, or habitual identity is placed into a radically different field. This gives Vajrayana a particularly strong formulation of the transformative half of the mode. The goal is not simply to tolerate what was forbidden, it is to transform the seeing through which it appeared as it did. The mature Vajrayana fruit, the mandala, overflows the ritual. But the ritual field cannot remain the final destination. If pure perception exists only after elaborate preparation inside a consecrated feast before a visualized deity, then a division remains. Here, awakened perception; there, ordinary existence. The mature movement must therefore allow the mandala to overflow its ritual boundary. Eventually, the ordinary cup cannot remain spiritually inferior to the skull cup. Ordinary food cannot remain metaphysically lower than tantric sacrament. An ordinary human encounter cannot remain outside what the deity practice reveals. The extraordinary support should become less necessary as perception itself changes. The transgressive support has completed its work when the world no longer needs the support in order to become includable. This is one of the clearest Buddhist expressions of the mature fruit developed earlier: reversible freedom. The practitioner no longer needs taboo in order to encounter sacredness. Agora, approaching fear, death, and disgust. Where Kaula emphasizes contraction around difference and Vajrayana adds transformation of the energies of bondage, Agora gives the mode some of its most visceral expressions. The cremation ground concentrates death, corpse, decay, pollution, fear, bodily dissolution, and the collapse of ordinary social identity. The characteristic movement is approach. What ordinary consciousness keeps at distance becomes the field of practice. But the mature logic of Agora is easily obscured by its most dramatic imagery. The cremation ground is an instrument. The skull is an instrument. The feared substance is an instrument. The deeper question is, what can consciousness not approach without contracting? And sometimes the answer is not a corpse, it is another human being: the sick, the dying, the disfigured, the socially degraded, the person respectable society refuses to touch. Here, Agora reveals an ethical dimension that superficial fascination with cremation grounds misses. The transgressive act may simply be the refusal to participate in another person's untouchability. The most profound violation of a pollution boundary may be to remain present with the human being whom the boundary was built to exclude. This is where transgression approaches compassion without becoming identical to it. Compassion responds to suffering. Transgression interrogates the exclusion that made the sufferer untouchable. Tibetan holy madness and crazy wisdom, transgressing the image of awakening. Tibetan holy madness should be distinguished from classical Vajrayana antinomian ritual, even though the two belong to overlapping tantric worlds. Here, the charged boundary often becomes spiritual respectability itself. A saint is expected to be dignified, controlled, solemn, predictable, recognizably holy. The holy madman violates the image. The practitioner may accept ridicule, scandal, misunderstanding, loss of prestige. The spiritual question becomes, must realization look like our inherited image of realization? At its mature edge, holy madness can destroy attachment to the social mirror. The practitioner becomes willing to lose the prestige generated by being spiritually accomplished. This connects Tibetan holy madness unexpectedly with Christian holy foolishness and Malamati spirituality, yet its shadow is particularly dangerous. The statement, realized activity may sometimes look unconventional, can mutate into unconventional activity demonstrates realization. Now scandal produces charisma. The teacher becomes more exceptional through precisely the behaviors that supposedly demonstrate freedom from identity. This is where crazy wisdom becomes metaphysical immunity, and Vajrayana contributes an additional danger through distorted pure perception. A practice intended to loosen fixation upon ordinary perception becomes self-sealing when disciples are required to treat evidence of harm as merely their own impure perception. Pure perception cannot mean compulsory misperception. Christian holy foolishness, Simeon of Emesa. Christianity develops a strikingly different version of transgressive spirituality through the holy fool, with Simeon of Emesa as one of its clearest exemplars. His importance lies partly in sequence. The foolishness follows prolonged ascetic formation. First comes discipline, renunciation, desert practice, containment. Only then return to society, deliberate scandal, ridiculous appearance, concealment of sanctity. This makes Simeon an almost perfect illustration of the transition from the ascetic-purificatory to the transgressive-transformative operation. Transgression follows discipline rather than replacing it. His foolishness also attacks a particularly subtle possession, the prestige of being holy. The practitioner may have renounced money, sex, comfort, and social advancement while becoming deeply attached to being recognized as someone who has renounced them. Holy foolishness cuts there. Can holiness survive the loss of the appearance of holiness? This produces one of the strongest contrasts with the counterfeit transgressive guru. The holy fool conceals realization behind transgression. The counterfeit transgressive teacher advertises realization through transgression. One loses charismatic capital, the other accumulates it. The outer strangeness may resemble itself. The psychological direction is opposite. Frehori Skovroda, the quiet refusal of capture. A neighboring Ukrainian Christian configuration appears in Hrihori Skovroda. He is not straightforwardly a holy fool, and his spiritual organization cannot be reduced to the transgressive mode. His thought contains strong contemplative, ascetic, philosophical, and Christian dimensions. Yet his wandering life, relative indifference to institutional prestige, refusal of conventional career capture, and persistent emphasis upon inner freedom place him near the transgressive archetype in another way. Skovoroda reveals that transgression can become quiet, no cremation ground is necessary, no public obscenity, no forbidden sacrament. The charge boundary may simply be the assumption a serious human life must acquire position, stability, institutional legitimacy, property, and a recognizable social identity. The person quietly declines. This is a valuable counterweight to the spectacular forms of the mode. Sometimes the deepest act is not entering something forbidden. It is remaining uncaptured by something almost everyone assumes must be desired. Malamatiya, transgressing the need to appear holy. The early Sufi. Malamatiya bring the mode to an especially subtle level. Here, the dangerous object is not necessarily bodily impurity or social prohibition, it is spiritual reputation. The practitioner recognizes that the ego can appropriate everything: prayer, renunciation, knowledge, mystical state, humility, self-sacrifice. Eventually, the person may no longer need ordinary status, but they still need to be recognized as spiritually advanced. The Malamadi impulse therefore turns against the social performance of sanctity. Conceal the state. Avoid displaying spiritual distinction. Live ordinarily. Do not feed the nafs through recognition of piety. In some expressions, even blame or misunderstanding may be tolerated rather than allowing sanctity to become another form of prestige. This produces one of the most penetrating questions in the entire mode. Can you lose the image of being good without losing your orientation toward the good? The object of transgression has become the witness. Freedom from the witness. The mature Malamati fruit is not merely anonymity. Anonymity itself can become identity. The deeper freedom is, my relationship to truth does not depend upon anyone knowing that I possess it. The practitioner may be visible or invisible, teach publicly, or live an ordinary profession. None is inherently superior. What dissolves is the necessity that spiritual depth becomes social identity. This becomes particularly striking in a contemporary world where insight so easily becomes profile, audience, teacher persona, course, institution, brand. Malamati spirituality asks whether transmission can occur without converting the transmitter into a center of prestige. But even this has a shadow. The person may become proud of being hidden, proud of not needing praise, proud of being more authentic than public teachers. The ego survives through inversion. Thus, mature freedom must eventually become reversible even here. The Avaduta, beyond rule and anti-rule. The Avaduta represents another endpoint. The practitioner appears beyond conventional rule, not necessarily because rules are being dramatically opposed, but because their internal function has ceased to organize identity. This distinguishes the Avadhuta from the rebel. The rebel still needs the rule. The Avadhuta archetype points toward a condition in which neither I obey nor I refuse to obey defines the center. The rule may be observed or not. No identity needs to be built from either action. This makes the Avadhuta especially valuable as an image of mature transgression. The highest transgressive freedom may arrive when transgression itself becomes unnecessary. The practitioner no longer requires a forbidden object in order to experience freedom. Dantoas. Primary and secondary configurations. A final distinction is necessary. Many spiritual practitioners encounter transgressive moments without the transgressive-transformative mode becoming their primary organization. A devotee may violate convention out of overwhelming love. A compassionate practitioner may touch the untouchable because another's suffering overrides social disgust. An ascetic may eventually cross a purity boundary after decades of restraint. A visionary may receive revelation that contradicts inherited doctrine. An architect may include transgressive systems within a much larger synthesis. The operation can occur without defining the whole consciousness. A primary transgressive configuration is different. Again and again, the practitioner intuitively notices the charged border. They ask, why can this not be approached? What is being protected? Why does this distinction possess so much energy? What would happen if the recoil disappeared? Such personalities appear relatively uncommon, but the visible signs of the mode are remarkably easy to imitate. Hence, one of its central paradoxes: the genuine configuration may be rare, while its costume is abundant. Skulls are easy, sexual rhetoric is easy, being provocative is easy, calling oneself beyond morality is easy. The difficult thing is approaching what genuinely binds consciousness without being captured by the force released through the approach. Return to proportion. When transgression itself can be relinquished. The transgressive-transformative mode easily appears greater than it is because its victories are dramatic. A taboo falls, a fear collapses, a practitioner crosses a boundary that had governed consciousness for years. Something changes quickly, sometimes astonishingly quickly. A single encounter can accomplish what gradual reflection did not. A ritual can concentrate years of psychological conflict into one event. A direct confrontation with death, impurity, sexuality, disgrace, or social exclusion can pierce a structure that ordinary spiritual life had only circled around. This power is real, but power is not rank, speed is not depth, intensity is not comprehensiveness. A spiritual operation can be unusually rapid without being universally superior. This distinction is especially important because transgressive traditions themselves have often been surrounded by an aura of secrecy, danger, qualification, and exceptional attainment. What few are permitted to do easily begins to look like what only the highest can do. Difficulty of access becomes confused with height of realization. But rarity does not establish supremacy, nor does danger. A practice may require unusual maturity because it is dangerous, not because it leads to a metaphysically higher destination. The person capable of handling a powerful method may simply require a different method. A high voltage path is not necessarily a higher path. This is perhaps the most important return to proportion for the mode. A dissolved boundary is not a transformed human being. This may be the most necessary correction of all. Suppose a practitioner successfully dissolves a profound sexual taboo. That is real. Suppose they lose fear of death. Real. Suppose caste pollution disappears from perception. Real. Suppose they can endure disgrace that once seemed intolerable. Real. None of these achievements tells us how the whole person has matured. A boundary has changed. The human being remains multidimensional. They may still be governed by admiration, status, anger, fear of abandonment, need for control, money, resentment, intellectual superiority, or inability to tolerate contradiction. This is why dramatic, transgressive accomplishment can create such misleading spiritual impressions. The practitioner has genuinely done something unusual. The achievement should not be denied, but it can be generalized far beyond its actual range. Freedom from one powerful contraction is not freedom as such. The mature understanding of the mode therefore becomes more modest. Not, I crossed the boundary, therefore I am free. But, this boundary no longer governs me as it once did. That is enough. The truth does not become smaller because the claim becomes more precise. Transgressive spirituality can easily generate another fantasy. Somewhere there is a final boundary. Cross that one, and consciousness will become completely free. The most forbidden act, the greatest fear, the ultimate surrender of identity, the taboo behind all taboos. This can turn spiritual life into a search for increasingly dramatic thresholds. But human conditioning does not necessarily organize itself around one final gate. A person may dissolve an extraordinary boundary and encounter a very ordinary bondage the next morning. The terror of impurity disappears. But irritation with one's child remains. Fear of death collapses. But insecurity at work persists. Sexual shame dissolves. But loneliness remains. The practitioner becomes capable of public disgrace, but still cannot admit a small mistake in conversation. This is not failure. It is simply the structure of human life. There may be no single act through which every layer becomes transparent. The dramatic boundary is not necessarily the deepest boundary. Sometimes the hardest threshold is embarrassingly ordinary. Accepting criticism, keeping a promise, remaining present in boredom, apologizing, bearing another person's need, working without recognition, allowing oneself not to be extraordinary. This is where transgressive glamour begins to fall away. Power without rank. The mode becomes easier to understand if its particular strength and weakness are seen together. Transgression can produce rapid penetration because it deliberately enters concentrated psychic charge, but concentrated charge also magnifies error. A practitioner who enters a high-intensity field with clear awareness may undergo powerful transformation. A practitioner who enters the same field through appetite, grandiosity, trauma, social pressure, or poor discernment may amplify precisely what the practice was meant to dissolve. Thus, the characteristic power of the mode and its characteristic danger are inseparable. The same feature produces both. This is why mature traditions surrounded some transgressive methods with qualification. Not because esotericism itself proves wisdom, but because a method capable of accelerating transformation can also accelerate distortion. The faster vehicle is not therefore better. Its usefulness depends upon driver, terrain, purpose, and conditions. A slower method may be exactly what allows transformation to become stable. The transgressive mode can therefore be acknowledged in full strength without being made supreme. Its methods may be among the most powerful in the history of spirituality. Under the right conditions, they can produce unusually rapid transformation. They can expose structures that gentler methods leave hidden. They can rescue spirituality from purity, repression, social hypocrisy, and fear. They can transform what consciousness had cast outside. None of this makes the mode the summit. A slow practitioner may become freer, a quiet devotee may become more transparent, an ascetic may become less self-centered, a compassionate practitioner may become more available to others, a transgressor may cross astonishing boundaries and remain deeply immature elsewhere. Different modes reach different knots. Their fruits cannot be ranked merely by dramatic intensity. This is one of the lessons the transgressive mode must itself accept. When transgression becomes another form of purity. There is an irony here. The practitioner initially attacks purity, then transgression itself can become purity. The person begins sorting the world. radical and conventional, alive and dead, authentic and repressed, tantric and bourgeois, free and moralistic. Now the transgressive side is treated as spiritually cleaner. The polarity has reversed. The underlying structure remains intact. This is one of the final knots of the mode. The practitioner must become capable of relinquishing the belief that transgression itself carries superior spiritual substance. The forbidden is not holier because it was forbidden, and convention is not spiritually lower because someone once had to escape it. A marriage can become bondage. It can also become mature love. Monastic discipline can become fear. It can also produce enormous freedom. An institution can suffocate. It can also support responsibility. Sexual experimentation can be transformative. It can also be compulsive. No external form possesses the mature fruit automatically. At this stage, the mode returns to the central question of the entire taxonomy. What operation is actually occurring? The transgression of transgression and the return of the ordinary. Eventually, the mode encounters its own final taboo, not being transgressive. This is an especially difficult threshold for personalities strongly organized around radicality. If transgression has become path, community, identity, authority, sexual culture, aesthetic, intellectual worldview, then stepping away can feel like betrayal. The practitioner fears becoming ordinary, bourgeois, conservative, domesticated, less alive. But if freedom requires permanently avoiding these identities, then they remain charged. The final transgressive act may therefore be to relinquish transgression itself. Not reject it, not condemn it. Simply stop needing it. The mode completes itself when it can transgress its own identity as the transgressive mode. This is one of the places where all 9 modes begin to touch a larger principle. Every mode matures by relinquishing its claim to be sufficient. The analyst must eventually stop believing analysis is the measure of everything. The ascetic must relinquish attachment to purification. The visionary must relinquish the authority of vision. The transgressor must relinquish the necessity of crossing. The operation remains available. Its sovereignty ends. The final movement of this mode should therefore be almost deliberately anticlimactic. After cremation grounds, forbidden substances, sexual rites, holy madness, wrathful deities, sacred fools, blame, public disgrace, ritual reversals, there is breakfast. Work. A child who needs something. A body aging. A house to clean. A conversation. Someone disagreeing. Ordinary food. Ordinary affection. Ordinary fatigue. If transgressive spirituality cannot return here, something has remained unfinished, because the purpose of the extraordinary encounter was not to make ordinary life contemptible, it was to make consciousness freer within reality. The highest fruit of a high-voltage path may be an ordinariness that no longer needs protection from the forbidden. The practitioner no longer requires a dramatic setting in order to know that nothing stands outside the sacred. The ordinary does not need to be intensified. It does not need to become esoteric. It can simply be sufficient. Freedom without spectacle and the human teacher. This is where holy foolishness, Malamati spirituality, Avaduta imagery, mature Kaula, and Vajrayana pure perception begin to converge in an unexpected way. The visible signs can fall away. The practitioner does not need the world to know what they crossed, what they realized, what they survived, what lineage authorized them, how radical their practice was. The truth of transformation becomes less dependent upon performance. This does not mean everyone must become anonymous. Visibility can be appropriate, teaching can be appropriate, public responsibility can be appropriate. But visibility ceases to authenticate realization, and invisibility ceases to authenticate humility. Both become available forms. Freedom without spectacle means that transformation no longer requires an audience, including the internal audience before which the practitioner performs their own radicality. This is one of the deepest mature fruits of the mode. There is another consequence. The transgressive teacher no longer needs to remain an archetype. They can become wrong, tired, limited, ordinary, correctable. This may be a higher achievement than maintaining the image of being beyond convention. The teacher can say, I misjudged that. That was my desire. That practice was not appropriate for you. I don't know. I changed my mind. These sentences may require more transgressive freedom than 100 dramatic rituals, because they cross the boundary protecting sacred authority. A teacher who can become human again may have relinquished a deeper identity than one who merely violates ordinary rules. This is where the criterion of corrigibility reaches the mature fruit, rather than merely functioning as a safeguard. The person does not simply tolerate correction, they no longer experience correction as metaphysical threat. Nothing needs to be exiled. At maturity, the original intuition returns in a different form. The mode began with what consciousness excludes can still govern it. It discovered that exclusion can create hidden sovereignty, that a person can be bound by recoil as surely as by craving. It approached what was feared, what was impure, what was socially impossible, what threatened identity, but eventually a deeper freedom emerged. Nothing needs to be metaphysically exiled, yet nothing therefore needs to be obeyed. This is the point at which modes 8 and 9 finally stand beside one another without opposition. Asceticism, not everything that arises deserves obedience. Transgression, not everything that arises deserves exile. Together, nothing needs to command consciousness merely because it appears, and nothing needs to be expelled from consciousness merely because it appears. The person can contain more of reality and require less from it. The final measure. The immature transgressor counts boundaries crossed. The mature one gradually stops counting. No collection of experiences proves freedom, no history of scandal, no sexual repertoire, no forbidden sacrament, no lineage, no reputation for madness, no amount of fearlessness. The final measure is quieter. How much of reality can now be encountered without compulsion, recoil, fascination, or the need to establish identity? How much difference can be tolerated without becoming exclusion? How much desire can arise without becoming command? How much fear can arise without becoming metaphysics? How much convention can be inhabited without servitude? How much freedom can exist without being displayed? This leads to the deepest formulation of the mode. The final measure is not how many boundaries a person has crossed. It is how few boundaries must now be either defended or violated in order for consciousness to remain free. The prohibition no longer needs to disappear. The practitioner no longer needs to defeat it. The whole drama of inside and outside gradually loses intensity. What remains is discrimination without contraction, inclusion without compulsion, freedom without spectacle. The skull can return to being bone. The forbidden substance can return to being a substance. The sexual act can return to being an act. The sacred fool can stop performing foolishness. The teacher can become a person. The practitioner can return from the boundary, and perhaps no one needs to know that it was ever crossed. The transgressive-transformative mode begins by turning toward what consciousness cannot bear to include. It completes itself when nothing needs to be excluded, merely so that freedom can survive, and when freedom no longer needs transgression in order to prove that it is free.